If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. Has anyone had encounters with strange creatures, cryptids, humanoids like the Wendigo, fairies, Mothman, Sasquatch, also called as Bigfoot, not deer, or any other worldly beings? I saw what I believe to be a dogman in Charleston County in the fall of 2011. I was deer hunting in my family swamp near the Antrim County line. The swamp bordered Lake Michigan on one side and cornfields on the other. I was coming out after dark with only a small flashlight when I noticed some noise coming from a tree line about 50 yards ahead. To put this into perspective, these swamps are highly populated with deer, foxes, coyotes, and plenty of small game. I wasn't spooked by the noise, but when I ran my flashlight across the tree line, I saw a 6-7 foot animal on 2 feet running away into the woods. I quickly got back to my truck and got the duck out of there. I was somewhat shaken up after that. I spent plenty of time looking for tracks the next day, but nothing came up in my search. Several weeks later, spotting was reported in Elk Rapids, around 30 miles away. I hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2014 and ended up being the camping cameraman for the show Finding Bigfoot for the final 2 seasons. First off, I didn't have any experiences while hiking, with the exception of some odd footprints in New Hampshire, but more often than not, it's just the double footprint of a bear. Western North Carolina, Tennessee, and Maine have the most sightings along the Ad. I've read and interviewed many people who've had encounters on the Ad and in the nearby areas and counties. More often than not, people will not talk about it in public because they're embarrassed, and this includes park rangers and law enforcement. Those interviews were what made me start to be more skeptical, given the sheer emotions people still had after experiences that happened years ago. My husband told me that when he was 15, it was evening, and he was walking through the bush from his grandma's house to his mother's house. He thought he saw a man in the dark standing under a tree, and it looked like he was smoking a cigarette, as there appeared a little orange speck of light in the darkness along with his shadow. Now, because he knew everyone in the area, it was a village, he just assumed the shape must be a neighbor, so he asked, "Hey bro, can I have a cigarette?" Well, as the shadow turned out, it wasn't a person whom he knew, it wasn't even a person at all, but a shadow creature that instantly transformed in size. It went from being a human-sized shadow figure to a tall, stretched, thin figure of 9 feet, and it ran and disappeared into a mango tree. Sumatra, Indonesia, 1990s. My story starts in January 1998. The Adirondacks and surrounding area were hit with the largest ice storm in decades. Roads were ice rinks, steps were booby-trapped, and trees burdened with literal tons of ice crashed to the ground by the millions. Inevitably, power lines of every purpose were hit by the collapsing forests, and they fared no better. Pretty much everyone from Glen Falls to Montreal was without power, some for more than 2 weeks. We lived in one of the dozens of small hamlets in Essex County, in the shadow of the J Range. Not as high as the high peaks, but in some places, just as primitive. Our closest neighbor was an octogenarian with mobility issues. We'll call her Mrs. Brown. In those days, hardly anyone had a generator, and she was no exception. She heated her home with a wood stove, but due to the treacherous ice, she was not about to refill the pine box on her porch with the larger supply in the woodshed. You have to help your neighbors in times of need, so my father, brothers, and I went over several times a day until the lights came back on. I was 13, the oldest of my siblings, and the last to leave Mrs. Brown's one afternoon. It was daytime, but the sky was a dingy lint trap sort of gray, still drizzling that same rain that froze to everything it touched, and I had to watch my step as I slip-stepped the quarter-mile home. Since I was looking down, I saw tracks in the ice. My boot prints, my brother's prints, and my father's boot prints. These were where we'd stepped when the ground was slushy, which later froze as the temperature dropped. My prints were perhaps an inch deep in the ice, my father's, maybe 2. But I saw another set of footprints that day, cutting across our path, from the woods that surrounded Mrs. Brown's house, and into the clearing across the road. They were bigger than my boots or even my father's prints, barefooted, and clearly human in shape. Even in the dimness of deep winter, it looked as clear as a child's footprint in wet sand in July. They were set deeper too, at least twice the depth of my father's prints. I was unnerved and ran or slipped home. My parents did not believe me when I told them what I'd seen in the ice on our neighbor's property. I took a disposable camera, black and yellow, Kodak, 19 years later, and it still stands clear in my mind, and made my way back to Mrs. Brown's to photograph what I had seen. But the light was lower, much lower, there is scant twilight in the mountains and in the woods, and more rain had frozen to the ground in the brief time I'd been gone. I got one shot of the ground where I thought the large, Naked feet had been, and that was all. I never saw any more tracks of whatever, or whoever it was. But I know that if you're going to do a Bigfoot hoax, you don't put down tracks in the middle of an ice storm, on a road where few people live, in front of the home of a woman who was practically bedridden at the time. I still have that one photo, and if I squint and sort of hope, I can see where there might have been a track, but it was never clear enough to convince anyone else. The Patterson film may be fake, and any Bigfoot hunting show is pure asinine cable TV fluff, but I still believe that something, or someone, is out there. I thought I would share. I have seen fairies. I lived in Georgia, still live super close by but now in Florida, and we had a lot of woods surrounding the house. The first time I saw one was while swinging over at the property my father owned across from our house. I was on the phone with a friend one night, and I saw this enormous orange-colored ball of light fly through the trees at the edge of the woods and disappear. I don't remember it as well as I would like, but I know it was huge. I remember staring speechless at the woods while my friend kept talking, but I wasn't listening because I was so stunned by what I'd seen. I'm sure I told her about it, but I don't think she thought much of it. The second time was even more amazing, and you'll understand why, I'm sure. This sighting happened in the woods near my house. I was walking up our driveway when I saw a tinier orange orb of light floating above the ground near the edge of the woods. It was like the first light, just a lot smaller. Miniature. I was tempted to try and grab it. I read in a storybook once that if you catch a fairy, it will grant a wish, but I was scared because I'd also read that if you touch a fairy, it will curse you. This is the part that makes this experience so much more amazing. A black cat that we had at the time also saw the fairy. It was watching it and reached up to swat at it. Right before its paw could make contact, the orb disappeared. It instantly vanished. Gone without a trace. It's so wild that I almost can't believe it happened, but it did. I've also seen a will-o'-the-wisp. I didn't know that's what it even was until a friend suggested it, and I looked it up, and it totally fit the description of what I'd seen. We had a swampy area at the edge of our property, so it made a lot of sense. That's also the direction it headed in. Skinwalker, run in? So me and two of my buddies were up in Lone Peak Canyon with a plan to sleep under the stars and leave the next day. So we got everything set up and decided to go swim in the lake. On our way back, we saw a single deer with abnormally large eyes and ears, and it had odd proportions in general. I've grown up in Utah Valley my whole life, and I've seen thousands of deer, so I know what they usually look and act like. The deer was sitting on a rock like a dog, and it turned its head to watch us without giving any reaction. Its head seemed to turn and follow while its body stayed perfectly still. It almost looked like its head was detached from its body. I decided that it was just an odd occurrence and that I should just ignore it. This was at 4 p.m. About 30 minutes later, while we were at our campsite, we saw the same deer chasing another, but it stopped and continued to just look at us for maybe 5 minutes. When we all looked away, it almost disappeared. Maybe it took off as soon as we looked away, but this was also odd. 30 minutes after that, we saw the same deer, probably 200 yards away, up on the side of the hill overlooking us. It stayed there for at least 45 minutes, just staring at us. The fourth time we saw it was later, around 9:30 p.m., when we were in our sleeping bags getting ready to go to bed. The deer came up from the river that we were next to, probably 20 feet away, and just looked at us again for maybe 2 minutes, then went back down. The same thing happened again in the same spot 15 minutes later. It almost seemed to be checking if we had gone to sleep yet. It continued to check on us one more time, 15 minutes later. At this point, I was a little freaked out but didn't want to say anything because I was afraid my friends would say I was imagining things. So we all tried to go to bed, and at about 10:30 to 10:45, we started hearing something, maybe 10 feet away, just under the hill that led to where the river was. We continued to hear what sounded like a deer walking in the river and coming to check on us. Every time it would get close, we would start talking and shine our lights into the trees to see if we could see anything. This happened enough to the point that we grabbed everything and left at midnight. On our way down, my buddies said they kept seeing silhouettes off to our sides. The entire way down, we kept seeing weird things. Like a deer right next to the road, staring at the mountainside at literally nothing. Not moving, reacting, or grazing. We continued to see more and more deer that were behaving oddly. But remember that we have all seen thousands of deer just up that canyon itself, and they have never behaved like that. Please, anyone, let me know if you think it might have been something. I was hunting in a rural part of southwest Michigan with my uncle. The area was a big clearing with trees all around it. You could see clearly across the whole thing. We were sitting on one end of the clearing, just inside the tree line. It was still clear daylight when we started hearing strange sounds. Like the howling or crying of an animal. We wrote it off as coyotes but thought it was strange since you rarely hear them during the day. After an hour or two of sitting there, the sun was just getting low, and I saw trees rustling across the field. My uncle had fallen asleep in his hunting chair next to me, but I was awake and alert. I saw a large figure moving slowly through the trees. It was as tall as the trees around it, so I would guess about 15 feet or more. Once it got to a spot with thinner trees, I got a good look at it. It walked upright and had long, thin arms that nearly dove to the ground as it walked. Its skin was dark gray, and its face was dirty white. Its face resembled that of a deer, but it was mostly a skull with little flesh on it at all. And it had 2 huge antlers on its head. It didn't seem to notice us as it walked from one side of the clearing to the other. I watched silently and observed it as it went. I wasn't scared, I was just fascinated. I thought about waking my uncle to see if I was really seeing this, but I didn't want to make any noise that would cause it to notice us. So I just watched as it disappeared through the trees on the other side. The issue I later realized was that the path back to the truck was directly through those same woods it just went into. So once it was dark, I woke up my uncle, and we pulled out our headlamps and started our trek out of the woods. I was kind of paranoid at this point because of my encounter earlier that day. The walk back seemed uneventful until we had almost made it completely out into the truck. We were both walking along the narrow path when we heard a young girl's voice say, "Do you want to play?" I knew he heard it too, because we both stopped walking and just looked at each other. We then ran the rest of the way to the truck and drove home very spooked. I never told him what I saw while he was asleep because I thought he would think I was crazy. He claimed that the voice was probably a person in the area, but there weren't any houses near enough. Also, the voice sounded very close to us. I never connected the two experiences that night until I did some research later on and found that Wendigos can mimic voices. We still hunt in those same woods frequently, and I haven't seen anything strange since. My ex-brother-in-law was a deputy in a small town in Michigan. He came over one evening and told us he had something to show us. We all went for a drive down this dirt road and came up on a weekender's cabin. It was actually a 2-story home. He took us around the outside of the house and showed us where something had attacked the cabin. The aluminum screen doors had puncture holes where the thing had bitten straight through them. There were puncture holes all around the door frames, and pieces of wood were lying on the ground where they had been torn off the frames. In the back, there was a huge picture window. Saliva and blood were dripping down the window. Whatever attacked that cabin had to have stood about 7 feet tall. The scariest thing of all was that the people who owned it left lights and a radio on when they left to deter burglaries. Whatever the thing was, it thought there were still people in it. While my dad was stationed at Alameda Air Base in San Francisco, he and some of his shipmates decided to go camping while on leave. They drove to a sporting goods store, I believe, near Berkeley, someone confirmed that, to get what they needed. While there, they met 2 professors from Berkeley. Apparently, these 2 professors were greenhorns, as my dad called them, and knew nothing about camping or supplies, so they asked my dad to help them pick out what they needed. Then, they told my dad that a Northern California logging company had contacted them at the university and asked them to come up to Northern California and investigate some large animal that was destroying things in one of their logging camps. They told my dad that someone or something was really wreaking havoc in the area and the workers couldn't get anything done, plus it was terrifying the loggers. My dad explained to the professors that he and his family operated as hunting guides in western Colorado, the San Luis Valley area near Wolf Creek Pass, so he was very skilled at tracking. They asked if he and his buddies wanted to come up with them and help track. I don't know exactly where he said they went, but I do remember it was near the California/Oregon state line, and I believe it was close to the ocean, but I could be off on that detail. He said when they got to the camp and scouted around the area, they found several giant footprints and plaster cast them. He said it looked like something or someone was scouting or walking around the perimeter of the camp. He went on to say that the workers took them to the fuel depot, where there were several footprints up to a collection of 55-gallon drums of diesel fuel. Something had walked up to, then around the depot, and then finally picked up one of the barrels and carried it off towards a nearby ravine. He said that the footprints became significantly deeper as the creature walked away from the fuel storage area, which would indicate that whatever had picked up the barrel had carried it without sitting down and then threw both the barrel and a large tractor tire into the ravine, then it walked back into the woods. That night, they had a fire going, and everyone was sitting around it, drinking beers and shooting the breeze. After a while, my dad said he noticed an eye shine that appeared to be 8 to 9 feet high just outside the firelight watching them. I believe that he said there were 2 sets of eyes, but I could be wrong. He told me that he'd quietly work his way back away from the group, then circle around the camp as quietly as he could to sneak up on whatever was standing close by. He said that no matter how hard he tried, including removing his boots and trying to sneak up in his socks, he never could get anywhere near whatever creature had the eye shine, and that it really frustrated him as a professional tracker because he couldn't get close to the animal. He'd return to the group, and 10 minutes later, the eye shine would return, and he'd quietly try again. Over the years, I asked him several times, "Do you think that was a Bigfoot?" Immediately he would respond, "No, I can't say it was a Bigfoot because I never actually saw the animal. However, we did find some very large footprint tracks. However, I know that there was something really big out there that was a better tracker than me, and whatever it was, it had really big feet. But exactly what I saw out there, I have no idea what it was." Hi, my name is Jorge, and I believe I had an encounter with the Dog Man of Manchester, New Jersey. To start off, my brother has taken me to this place called Abandoned Brick Factory, and I thought it was pretty cool, so I decided to go back there with a group of friends one night, and to my horror, we encountered something that I never thought would be real. So, like I stated above, my friends and I came back to the Abandoned Brick Factory to explore. When we arrived, we decided to go towards the path that leads to the Abandoned Brick Factory, and as soon as we got there, we felt an eerie presence, and we felt like we were being watched. My friends and I were a little spooked, and as our eyes darted all along the wood line, I spotted something. In the wood line up ahead, I saw something that shouldn't be possible or that shouldn't exist. To my horror, there was what looked like a werewolf. Its piercing yellow eyes were staring into my soul, and it gave me the creeps when I was looking at it. To describe it, it was very tall, abnormally tall, and I would say about 9 to 10 feet tall at the head, with large wolf-like or dog-like perked ears and a long snout. Its body was similar to the build of an Olympic bodybuilder, with large muscles that were visible through the mass of fur that was standing there. But its head was similar to that of a German shepherd or wolf, and its hands ended in claw-like digits. I blinked to make sure that this wasn't in my imagination, and to my horror, my friends reacted to it as well. My friends also saw this eerie presence, and they were all startled. To me, it felt like it was beckoning me to come closer, and its stare was so quiet and soul-piercing, which both weirded me out and gave me the same sensation a deer would have when seeing headlights. It felt like it was waiting for the perfect time to strike, and I felt a primal sense of fear when looking at this creature. It kind of also reminded me of an Egyptian jackal, except this shouldn't be real. The creature didn't do anything but stare at us and make us feel intimidated, and once we felt like it was gone, we ran out of that area. To this day, I'm still not exactly sure of what I saw, but when my brother showed me an illustration of a dogman, it made me shudder with fear. Whatever I saw that night looked just like the illustration my brother showed me, and to this day, I'm still in disbelief with what I saw. I will never go back to that location. I felt like I was in danger the entire time, and I felt like this creature was trying to intimidate us and warn us to never come back to its territory. In conclusion, I don't know what I saw that night, but I hope I never meet it again, and things really do go bump in the night. Be careful out exploring in the Pine Barrens, and never go to the brick factory at night. I believe I saw what a lot of people call a not deer last fall. I live in Colorado, in a mountain town south of Denver. The road I live off of is a winding back road through a valley. One side of the road is right against rock, steep like a wall in some places and more sloping in others, and the other side kind of drops off into the valley. It might also be worth noting that the mountain on the other side of the valley is a huge burn site with nothing but skeleton trees. This was probably around late August or early September. I was driving home late, probably around 1 a.m. I know the road and all the curves pretty well, so I was going at a pretty decent speed and probably wasn't being as actively aware of my surroundings as I should have been, especially since deer and elk are pretty common here. Anyway, I was coming up on the last curve before my street, and I saw a deer standing at the side of the road with a rock face. This deer was standing completely still, facing the rock wall. That in itself doesn't sound too strange, I know, but there was just something unnatural about its stillness. And the fact that it was staring straight into the rock, nowhere it could go, was odd. But what has stuck with me is the feeling I immediately got upon seeing it. Just an ungodly pit in my stomach. It felt like my heart had stopped. And this wasn't the OSHT, the deer on the side of the road surprised me kind of stomach pit, this was an absolute feeling of dread. It also seemed like there was something just off about the deer. For the life of me, I can't picture it in my head or pinpoint what it was, but something proportion-wise was wrong, like maybe its legs were a little too long or its torso was stretched out. I'm not sure. I didn't have time to really react other than just slow down a bit, I just kept driving. As I rounded the curve, I literally could not take my eyes off the rearview mirror, and the thing didn't move at all. Not a flinch, nothing. Just stone still. Even after it was behind the curve and I couldn't see it anymore, I still couldn't peel my eyes off the rearview. I pulled into the garage and hit the garage door closer before I had even parked, and when I got out of the car, I couldn't stop myself from running up the stairs. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, like I was in danger. I'm not by any means superstitious. I like stories about cryptids, and I think they're super interesting, but I've never really believed them. But since that night, as short-lived as that encounter was, if there is one supernatural thing I believe in, it was that creature. I know in my gut that it wasn't just a deer. It's also worth noting that after I told my visiting friend about the experience, she admitted that the year before, when she was visiting for the first time, she felt a similar dread or pit in the stomach as we approached that same spot. It seems like the knot deer is pretty new, and there aren't a whole lot of stories and sightings of them, but from what I have read, I am led to believe that that's what I saw that night. Late one night, in July of 2019, I was driving on a back highway, somewhere in mid-Missouri. I was the only vehicle on the road for what seemed like quite a while. I had my high beams on, keeping my eye on the road, listening to music, when all of a sudden, some humanoid creature ran at a high speed across the road in front of me, causing me to swerve to avoid hitting it. I grew up in the Midwest, so I am not unfamiliar with things crossing my path at night, but this creature left me absolutely terrified. I have never seen anything like it before or ever since, and I have absolutely no answer as to what this creature was. It was running on all fours, but it was big. I want to say probably 4 feet from the ground to the top of its back. It looked like a tall, lanky humanoid with bare skin and bones, long black hair, and a sunken face with empty eyes. When those eyes met with mine, pure terror came over me, not understanding what I was seeing. The closest thing I've been able to find that even slightly looks like what I saw would be some drawings of skinwalkers. I would love to have anybody try to help me figure out what this was. It has not ceased to terrify me when I think of it. Let me start off by saying I'm a 21-year-old male from British Columbia, Canada, and I've spent most of the free time in my life outdoors one way or another. This took place several months ago, right before winter started for real. I had a couple nights to myself this particular weekend and decided I would go on one last camping trip before it got too cold to sleep outside anymore. I texted some buddies to see if anyone wanted to tag along, but in the end, I ended up going into the bush solo. There's plenty of good forest roads around where I live, so we'd usually just drive up a dirt road until we found a nice spot and camp there, which is exactly what I did, in a spot I had camped before, no less. Anyway, I got my fire going, set up my tent and sleeping bag, and kicked back to start drinking my little night away. I was having a great time for the first couple hours. It was late in the season, so the sun was setting early, but I had enough wood to keep a fire going all night and enough beer to keep up. I'd camped solo many times before, so I really didn't mind loosening up a bit. However, I didn't get that chance. I don't remember falling asleep or what time it even would have been. I just remember waking up around 9 p.m., still sitting in my chair before the fire, with the deepest feeling of dread I have ever felt in my life. The fire was still going strong, so I couldn't have been asleep for long, but I had this unshakable feeling that something was watching me. Bears would have been in hibernation at this point, and I know what it feels like to be watched by a coyote. This was something different. I decided the amount I'd had to drink was clearly enough, and I tried to shake the feeling. I got my good knife and flashlight ready just for good measure as I sat with my back to the fire, looking into the tree line, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something up there just waiting for me to slip up. I was getting tired again after a while, but I knew I wouldn't be comfortable in the tent, so I decided to drop the back seats and sleep in the hatch of my car. At least I could lock the doors that way. Again, I have no idea what time I went to sleep, but eventually I managed to, until I woke up from the most vivid, horrifying dream I've ever had. I saw myself from a third-person perspective, sleeping in my folding chair in front of the fire, in the exact same camping spot, with exactly the same details as the scene I had woken up from not even an hour before. As I watched myself sleep in the chair, slowly the glowing eyes of coyotes emerged from the trees until they surrounded and ate me. I woke up in a cold sweat with a worse dread than I had felt before. I had felt being eaten by the dogs, and at that point, I didn't even know what a dream was or what was real. I just knew I needed to get off the mountain. I left everything set up at the campsite and crawled into my front seat to drive back down the road. On my way down, I saw one single deer stare at me, and as I passed it, it walked to the middle of the road and watched me drive away. I went back the next morning to get my camping gear, and nothing was out of place. But those dreams and that deer still haunt me if I think about them too long. I'm not sure if it was truly a skinwalker or just the rural paranoia of growing up in a small town, but I tell you, I never look at deer the same anymore. So I've recently come across a video explaining different paranormal creatures people have come into contact with. Normally, I think these things are essentially bogus. However, one of them struck a chord with me. A couple years ago, when driving home in Phoenix late at night, I witnessed something fly out of the big tree in front of my house. I would normally assume it was just a big bird, but this thing was huge, fast, and dark. It flew across my street and over the house in a second. It had to have been at least 6 feet tall. What really scared me was that even though I had my headlights on, the creature was pitch black. Now many people claim that the Mothman, or so it's called, is really just an owl. I don't know if there are owls in Phoenix, but I do know that no owl I have ever seen is that massive or that fast. I literally sat in my truck, completely frozen, for at least 3 minutes. I'm wondering if anyone else has had an experience with this thing, because I feel like I'm just crazy, but at the same time, I know what I saw, and I'm really having a hard time believing it was an owl. This was when I was about 18 years old. I'm now 21, but I went camping with some family members at the border of Oklahoma, and there were some really flat lands out there. There were also really long ways to get back to any type of civilization. We were staying out in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it was about 2 a.m. at night. I was still awake, lying on the couch. The cabin was built to the point where there were 2 big windows at the front, and you could see about 2 miles from there. I had my body facing the windows so that I could look outside, a beautiful view. By the way, it was a darker night than usual and you could hear the frogs outside, but it had suddenly gone quiet while I was awake for those couple of hours, and I felt like I was being watched, so I looked out of the front right window and I saw a huge silhouette standing by a very large tree, and compared to the darkness of it, it could have reached about 6 feet to 7 feet tall. I had to really look, but it stood there for a couple of seconds, and I'm sure it knew I noticed it. I saw it move across the flat field and away from the cabin, and it really spooked me. I had no flashlight, so I couldn't tell you if it had eye shine. I'm not saying it's a Bigfoot, but there is a possibility. So for context, this was about 7 months ago. I'm just now sharing this because I've been thinking about it lately, and I thought maybe I could share my experience and finally give myself some information from other people's opinions on this story. This is 100% real, and my girlfriend was with me at the time for credibility that I wasn't tripping. I live in Tennessee. I was 100% sober, I slept fine the night before. Nothing was interfering with me to make this up in my head. I don't have any medical conditions other than ADHD. This story happened, I would say, around 12 or 1 a.m. or so. So I own a small shed next to my house. I have a TV in the shed, so some nights I'll go out to the shed and hang out by myself and chill while watching some movies. My girlfriend was over at the time, so we decided to go watch a new movie that came out around that time. I have a cool TV set up in there, so it's sometimes better to watch it there than in the house. Anyway, I always leave out the back door when I go to the shed, and most of the time I usually leave it open until I come back in. I live in a less popular and non-sketchy neighborhood, so there's usually no problem with people being around to break in or anything. At the time, I owned a dog that was in the final stages of being deaf and blind. She was a small Yorkie/Shih Tzu mix. She could barely see anything, if anything at all. Can you see where this is going? I go back into the house after the movie, with my girlfriend, and I go to the bathroom, and I notice I don't hear my dog walking around doing her nightly blind walks in the house. Usually she'll snoop around the house for no reason, but I think it's because she can't see much or is getting dementia. So I look absolutely everywhere in the house, and she's nowhere to be seen. Me and my GF are both dumbfounded, and we start thinking she somehow managed to leave through the back door. Take note that you have to go from the hallway to my room, to a back room, to the back door, and to the back porch that's raised about 4 to 5 feet off the ground. So we decide we'll look around outside just in case she somehow manages to get lost, come out of the back porch, and fall off the porch. She had to have fallen off because it's a pretty big drop, and she was almost completely blind. Well, we looked for a bit, and still nothing. There is absolutely no sign of her anywhere. No blood from a fall. I didn't hear any squeals when we were in the shed prior, nothing. There was literally no sign she ever got out, but we searched absolutely everywhere. So there's a small patch of wood behind my house, and I thought if she escaped, surely she couldn't be too far away. So we start walking out to the small, wooded area to look for her. I have my phone flashlight on, and my girlfriend is walking with me. All of a sudden, I start hearing a few leaves crunching, and I think, thank God, I found my dog. I put my flashlight over where I heard the leaves crunching, and I saw a hooded figure. They're probably about 15 to 20 feet away or more, and they're just slowly walking, pretty much at a complete stop, when I put the flashlight on them. I end up taking the flashlight off of them, and I tell my girlfriend there's somebody snooping around out here, and we should probably go back in. Next thing you know, I hear the leaves crunching again, and I turn the flashlight towards where the figure was, and I just can't believe my eyes. All of a sudden, it switches to a tall gray figure running super fast to the left of the woods. This thing is absolutely faster than anything I've ever seen. As soon as I saw it do that, my whole body was just hit with a big wave of cold chills. I can't even explain the feeling. It felt like the chills went from the top of my head down to my toes. I absolutely booked it, almost even leaving my girlfriend behind. After we got back into the house, I asked her what she had seen, and she said she didn't get to see it. She only heard the leaves crunching like something was running really fast. I just absolutely couldn't believe my eyes, and to this day, I still don't know what the heck it was. It was literally like someone with a hoodie and their hood over their face, and then it turns into a tall, skinny gray figure absolutely running faster than anything I've ever seen. I never found my dog, and I never found any proof she even got out. We've checked every crevice of the house and even posted on Facebook about her being missing in an effort to find her. Nobody ever did, and now she's just a memory. But it still makes me wonder to this day if what I saw is somehow connected with my dog's disappearance. I overthink it, thinking, what if it went into the house when the door was open and grabbed her or something? I'll never forget the story, and it was my first ever encounter with something crazy like that. It actually kind of feels good to share this story. Maybe others can relate or have experiences similar to mine. Since then, I haven't encountered anything out of the ordinary, but I still feel paranoid when going into my shed when I can see the woods in the corner of my eyes. The day after that incident, we even explored the small wooded area to see if there was any proof of the creature being there or even my dog, and there was no proof of either. I wish I knew what happened to my dog also, but I know at least she isn't suffering from blindness and being deaf anymore. When I was younger, around 13 or so, me and my older brother, who at the time were 16, were walking home from what was kind of like a youth center, where basically you do a bunch of activities. This was in October or so. It was around 10 p.m., and since the youth center wasn't far away from home, we decided to just walk instead of catching the bus. If we were to catch the bus, we would have to wait for about an hour. We live kind of far away from the city, on a farm, with 3 to 4 neighbors. So to get home, we had to walk on a big road. But since it was pretty late, we figured no cars would be out. This night we had a horror night at the youth center. Basically, we played horror games and watched scary movies. I'll skip the boring shit. When we were at the bus stop outside our farm, around 200 meters or so from our house, we heard footsteps. Mind you, this bus stop is surrounded by fields where, during the fall, they grow corn. My brother stopped and turned around. I noticed he stopped walking, so I turned around to ask him why he'd stopped. I look at my brother, who's standing completely still with his back against me. And what I'm about to write is so bizarre, and I don't care if you believe me or not, but I honestly don't ducking care. I look over my brother's shoulder, and what I see still horrifies me to this day. I see a moose, skinned and bloody, standing on 2 legs. It had completely white eyes, and it was standing there, staring at my brother. I can hear my brother whispering my name and telling me to run on his command. I didn't say anything, I just stood there, horrified and paralyzed from fear. I don't remember what my brother said, but he all of a sudden turned around, grabbed my arm, and started running. I've never run that fast in my entire life. I've never seen my brother that scared either. We ran all the way back home, and all the time I could hear quick footsteps behind us. But I knew better than to look back. When we got home, my brother was crying. He was crying hysterically, and he had told my mom what had happened. At that time, I and my brother shared a room. My bed was at the window, while his was closer to the door. We didn't sleep that much that night. And there are 2 reasons. Reason number 1, we had seen a ducking moose standing on 2 legs, chasing us. And number 2, that whole night, we could hear scratching on the wall to our bedroom from outside and footsteps, as if a dog were running around. Our neighbors don't have any animals. We lived on the 2nd floor. To this day, my brother has never been willing to talk about what happened that night. I have a story of a creature on my hunting land from when I was a kid. When I was about 10 years old, I was hunting with my grandfather, now deceased, on family-owned land near Covington, Michigan. It was near dusk, and we've been sitting for a couple hours now. We haven't seen much, just a spiker and a small doe, nothing large enough to shoot. We were starting to lose hope and were getting ready to start the about 1-mile trek back to our cabin. As we were preparing to leave, we heard some twigs cracking from our right rear side. The stand we were in was tucked in the rear corner of a large clearing on one of the bigger trees in the tree line. As the cracks from the twigs got closer, I remember realizing that all other ambient noises stopped. When the creature finally emerged from the tree line, I remember my heart feeling like it stopped working and an overwhelming feeling of dread washing over me. What I saw was what looked to be a small buck that looked like it hadn't eaten in weeks and was an extremely pale brown, almost gray, with what looked to be a broken neck and a missing antler stumbling into the clearing. At this time, the sun was just about to sink below the treetops and cover the clearing with shadows. I recall looking over at my grandfather and seeing a level of fear I had never seen on his face before. Mind you, my grandfather was tough and fearless, as he'd seen active duty in Vietnam as infantry. After seeing my grandfather's face, it just made the feeling in my stomach worse. As we watched this deer stumble into the clearing, my grandfather reached for his binoculars. As he pulled them out, the lens cover made a small noise on the side of the stand. The creature must have heard it because it stopped its stumble, now in the middle of the clearing, and creepily rotated around, rose up on its hind legs, and stared directly at us for about a minute before running off in a creepily awkward sprint into the woods. At this time, it felt like I had just gotten the wind knocked out of me, and I was petrified with fear. After the encounter, me and my grandfather sat in the stand, completely silent, staring at the clearing, trying to make sense of what we just witnessed. As we started to walk back, we heard extremely weird, almost human-sounding noises coming from the woods around us. By the time we got back to the cabin, my grandfather decided it'd be best to call our trip early and head back home, but before we left, I had to use the bathroom, and our cabin was quite old, so I didn't have indoor plumbing, just an old outhouse. As I sat down to use the toilet, the immense feeling of dread returned as I heard human-like whispers and small scratches on the back of the outhouse. I screamed at the top of my lungs to my grandfather as I ran out of the outhouse, crying. After that, we drove back home and had a small discussion about what we saw. Despite being an avid hunter, that was my grandfather's last season of hunting, and about a year later we sold the land. I've told this story a couple times to close friends and family, but I think most of them think I'm crazy, especially being the only witness now that my grandfather has passed away. Still to this day, the encounter sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. I was heading to work at about 4:30 in the morning, and I was zoning out. I was in the left lane of a 2-lane highway because of a parked car on the side of the highway. As I started passing the car, something caught my eye, coming straight at me from the median on the left side. I got a brief look at a humanoid creature running on all fours, not with that awkward run that people do when they try to run on all fours, more like a deer when it runs. It had long arms and long legs and was very skinny. It looked like a 6-7 foot tall golem. I can't be sure if it wasn't a dark color on top and a pale color underneath because I only saw it for about 5 seconds. It looked straight at me as the car was about to hit it, but it disappeared right when I got to where it was. I have no idea what I saw, I just described it to a friend, and Skinwalker was the term he used. He showed me a picture, and both me and my wife, who was there with me, jumped out of our seats because it was nearly a perfect representation of what we saw. Also, again, this is a super simple story. In late August last year, my wife and I decided to take a trip to Fredericksburg, TX, to celebrate our engagement. We were there for wine tasting, beer houses, and cute knick-knack shopping. The casual/vanilla fun stuff we die for. If you haven't been in Cannes, do go. It's great. We had a cabin rented out in the Wash, I think they called it. It was dry land surrounded by hills, and just imagine your typical dry western environment. Brown hills, some trees and random cacti everywhere, and signs saying no burning scattered around the property and next to the fire pit, which we thought was pretty hysterical. We were on our way back past 10 p.m. from downtown, and we had these what we called cow roads to get back to the cabin because there were cattle scattered on both sides of the road, all the gates were open, and you'd have to wait for them to cross every now and then. We joke that the cows own these roads, we're just tourists. This is all to say, we were driving slowly because, God forbid, a cow walked in front of us. I'd 1-to-1 total my Jeep, but worst of all, it hurt or possibly killed someone's cow, and it left us open to what happened next. We were talking, laughing, making jokes, and trying not to focus on how it was pitch black around us. My convertible top was down, and we just felt vulnerable. In front of us was this black figure on the left side of the road, dirt road, mind you, not very wide, maybe a car and a half. It was on all fours, had a short body, long legs, and a massive head, and was black. As we got closer, there was a mix of black and gray in its skin and fur, but it was hard to tell what was fur or skin. I wasn't nervous, but I slowed down because I didn't want to hit this thing, which I thought was some sort of wolf or coyote, and we were maybe something over 500 feet away and getting closer. By the time I could really look at it, it was in the middle of this road, and we were even closer. It was literally a stone's throw away, and it turned to face, but as it turned, it stood up, and what we thought were back legs were just human-like, because this thing stood up, looked at us, and turned back the way it came. But went back to all fours as it walked. When it faced us, its eyes glowed yellow. I remembered wolves glowing red, I could still be wrong. Which added to my confusion in the moment. This thing looked so off, and we realized its short body was more like our torso, and it moved so awkwardly because it really was like a person walking on all fours. But its head. It was a thing of nightmares, that's all I know. It looked right at us. I had my brights on, so maybe it was actually blinded and just left, but I was scared enough to think it looked right at me. I started driving off, and my wife and I didn't say a word for a few minutes that felt like forever. She started to say, "Did you?" And I just said, "Yeah," before she could finish her sentence. If she wasn't there to confirm it, I would have said it was a trick of the night and gone to bed. I was driving home after seeing my boyfriend. I don't know if y'all care about this, but, FYI, I am a 19-year-old female. I want to be completely honest, so y'all know I'm not lying. I hit a dab cartridge once or twice right before this happened, but I have a very high tolerance and no history of weed-induced psychosis or hallucinations. I even doubted myself about what happened until I told my boyfriend when I got home. This drive is about 45 minutes each way, and it is something I do often, like 3 to 4 times a week. I know these roads very well, and I'm not easily spooked. I was about 15 minutes into my drive home. It was raining pretty heavily as I was coming down this one highway, and it's pretty dark with only a few street lights here and there. I was pretty much alone on the streets for most of my drive home since it was late and raining. As I was going down this highway at like 60 miles per hour, I suddenly saw this tall, deer-like figure in my headlights about 200 feet from me. I immediately started braking because, from a distance, I thought it was just your typical big buck standing in the middle of the road. It happens all the time in Pennsylvania, as we have no shortage of deer. But as I was approaching closer to this deer, I saw that it's freakishly tall and very slender. It almost looked like someone took an image of a deer and stretched it out vertically, honestly. I also noticed that my headlights aren't lighting this thing up, not even my brights. All I see of it is a bold, black silhouette right there, in the middle of the road, unmoving. Because all I see is the silhouette, I can't tell if it's standing on 4 legs or 2, but the height and stretched out quality of its appearance have me thinking it's 2. I was struggling to brake fast enough to avoid this deer without spinning out on the wet roads, but I eventually slowed down, and as I get slower and closer to this thing, it starts going fuzzy. I squint. I turn my wipers on faster. It's still fuzzy. As I came to a full stop, it suddenly just disappeared. Completely vanished into thin air. So now I'm stopped in the middle of the road on this empty highway, thinking I'm going insane because this roughly 12-foot tall figure that I know I saw just isn't there anymore. It didn't jump out of the way, it didn't run, it just vanished. I shake off the spooks, and I hit the gas again, trying to convince myself that I'm going crazy because the alternative is too scary to think about. A few minutes down the road, I see something else. This time a lot smaller, closer to the size of your average deer. But it definitely wasn't a deer or any animal that is widely accepted as real because it just suddenly showed up in front of my car. It wasn't on the left side of the road at all until it was in front of my car, running across the road. I should have hit it. It was right in front of me. With the speed I was going, there was no way that it would have made it across the street in time since it was maybe 5 feet from my car when it first appeared. I didn't even get a chance to brace myself for impact with how close it was. But nothing happened. I didn't hit anything. Not even a rock is under my tire. At this point, I'm convinced that I've gone certifiably insane. I checked my rearview mirrors to see if there was even a deer, but it was too dark to tell. The rest of the way home, I drove as slowly as I could safely, just in case I saw something again. Alas, I made it home without another incident. I don't know what exactly I saw. I don't know why. If it was a Wendigo, it didn't hurt me since everything I know about Wendigo points to them being malevolent beings. I'm just freaked out, I guess, and wanted to share my story. If anyone has a better identification for whatever this thing was, let me know. For now, I think I'm going to get myself a dash cam. Pennsylvania roads are ducking spooky. To start, it was this summer, and I was 14. I spent the night at my friend's house. Let's call her Cynthia. So I rode the transit 20 or so miles east. I don't really go east since I live on the beach cliff. Beach towns are more popular, but going inland for a while is just a highway. This town in the middle of the woods was only visited by tourists if they were truly lost because it was a 10-mile hidden turn from the main highway. This town was one long road with a grocery store, gas station, and motel, with multiple roads down to pretty old houses. This place had some history pertaining to the local native tribe. With tall, opaque walls of forest everywhere, I was on high alert because Wendigos were talked about seriously and seen often. After walking down the completely quiet road for some time, I made it to her house. It was around 10 p.m. when I arrived. Some time later, we got bored, of course, and decided to walk to Cynthia and my friend Kimias's house and decide to steal some weed from his dad's greenhouse. 3 a.m. and some irrational decisions later, we are walking down the road and shivering cold. We cut through the trailer park, and for some reason, we had so much unexplainable adrenaline and also jumped over a 7-foot baseball fence that is curved inwards to the field, making tremendous noise while climbing and jumping. We regretted it instantly, and we both turned scared after noticing that we were now on the baseball field, and to our left were exposed woods. Cynthia looked scared shitless, and I picked up on it fast since we stood there in silence, and it was pitch dark as there wasn't a street light for about 30 feet. I whispered, "We can't jump back over the baseball fence because it's curved," so we started to walk along the fence with Cynthia looking, turning around frequently. After about 20 feet, we turned around and saw a freakishly tall thing about half a football field away on our side of the fence. It was illuminated on its left side by somebody's window. We froze and stared while my heart dropped, my face went cold, and my stomach retracted in fear. I couldn't tell what way it was facing. But this horrid thing moved slightly, and I noticed one thing: the legs were bent backwards like a deer. It was standing 2-ish feet above the fence, making it almost 9 feet tall. We booked it and ran the short distance to the public trail bathrooms across the deserted road. She pushed me inside in front of her. We locked the door instantly, choosing to be trapped. She grabbed her phone hesitantly, and we looked at the empty bars. Obviously, sleep wasn't an option. We sat in that bathroom, freezing on the concrete floor for hours. Around the 30-minute mark, we heard gravel right outside the bathroom. We both slowly slid across the bathroom, still not letting each other go. Under her coat, clearly, this thing was circling us. After 3 or 4 obvious circles, it slowly went back to silence. I watched the sun come up. We heard some cars go by since daylight, and we decided on the next faint sound of a car that we'd run to the early open gas station. Cynthia was drinking out of the sink when I took her out of the car. We both grabbed out backpacks, and she swung the heavy door open like it was nothing. After the short sprint and inside the station, I looked through the glass door and thought I saw it approximately 25 feet from the bathroom, pretty sure that it was walking into the forest. When I turned around, I told her that I couldn't see it anywhere and that it was probably far gone. This happened in 1970, or maybe 71. I was 14 or 15. My friend and I were in the Boy Scouts, and that summer we went to Arkansas to do a couple hikes for some merit badge, if I remember correctly, and one of them was the Butterfield Hiking Trail. The trail started in Devil's Den State Park, and that is where we camped. When we awoke, we started the hike. Remember, this was 1970, the trail wasn't well marked and wasn't that heavily traveled. Our gear was rudimentary, I'm not even sure I had real boots. All our gear was pretty much army surplus stuff, canteens, compasses, tents. We must have had a map, but I think it is not much better than a hand-drawn map. I just checked, and today it says the trail is 15 miles. It certainly wasn't then, and we had planned on doing it as a day hike and just carried a canteen each, the map, and a compass. Being scouts, we probably had some sort of first aid kit we put together. There was a trailhead we could walk to when we got up in the morning, and initially the trail was pretty well beaten down. The terrain wasn't too tough. It was a deciduous forest, very thick underbrush. It was also summer and would get pretty hot, and there was a lot of humidity. I don't recall anything unusual or exciting for most of the hike until the trail we were following eventually petered out. I really have no idea how far we hiked, but it was pretty hot, and it was late afternoon, I think. So, we realized we were lost on the trail and probably too late to head back the way we came. While trying to figure out what to do, we believed we heard a motor vehicle in the distance off to the west. We figured getting to a road would be the best option, but in order to get there, we would have to bushwhack through dense underbrush. At least it was downhill. So, we headed down the hill. Again, I am not sure how long or far it was, but we broke out on a very nice, wide, and well-traveled trail. Hallelujah. We were really hot and tired from going through the brush, so we sat down to rest and drink some water. We were both relieved to at least find a well-traveled trail. We could also hear what we thought might be a creek flowing. This is where things got weird. While we were resting, we heard something in the bush just up the slope, not too far away. The best way I could try to describe it is as some sort of monkey or ape yell. Just after that yell, we heard a tree shake and heard a thump or thud. We could see the top of the tree sway. Big tree. This was also uphill and really not that far away. The trail we had found pretty much ran horizontally down the slope. That is the direction we had planned on going. There was a dip in the trail and a curve that went out of visual sight. We were curious what was making the noise, and I told my friend to start down the trail, and I would hang back and stay kneeling where I was. The thought was that maybe the creature that yelled or screamed would show itself thinking, which we both had taken off. My friend disappeared out of sight, and the creature we heard called out again, but this time another creature further down the trail, where my friend went, yelled back. I couldn't see anything through the brush, and I must have realized hanging back wasn't the best idea, so I got up and stared down the trail. I then realized the trail wasn't too far from where the tree shook, made noise, and screamed. By this point, I was feeling pretty uncomfortable. I got to the point where the trail headed straight down the hill, and my friend was waiting there, so we headed down. My friend was in the lead, and as soon as we started down, I heard something running through the brush from where we had just come. I immediately yelled at my friend to run. I wasn't sure if it was running after us or not, but I looked back over my left shoulder and saw it running back up the trail we had just come down. Like I said, the brush was thick, and I only caught glimpses except at one point where I could see its chest, shoulder, and face. I was running down the hill looking back, and it was running up the trail and looking down at us. It's crazy, it's been almost 55 years, and I vividly remember the whole encounter. It was only a glimpse. I saw black hair, and the face had a sheen from the sun. It was looking at us while we were running west and into the sun. I know it was pretty tall because, walking down the trail, I could not see anything down the slope. This thing was tall enough to be seen by us. The rest is anticlimactic, but I should go ahead and finish the story, I suppose. We kept running down the hill until we came out of the brush and into a clearing with a herd of cattle next to the creek we heard. We thought we saw a bull, and we sprinted across the creek. Nothing had chased us, and there was also the road we had heard. A gravel or dirt road, but a road just the same. We headed north, I believe, and eventually a guy in a pickup drove by and gave us a ride to our camp. That night, I remember washing my clothes at the campground laundry, talking to a park ranger, and telling him about our day. He didn't think we were crazy and said people see some pretty strange things out there. This was before the internet, and I really had not heard anything about Bigfoot sightings. Now, with the internet and reading all the people's experiences, I read and nod my head because I know exactly what some of these people are talking about. Like I said, I'm older, and I stayed in touch with my friend all these years. I wanted to confirm what I remembered with him, and this is what he remembers as well. Although, when I yelled, he did just that, and he didn't look back, so he didn't see what I saw. My friend and I are still trying to process exactly what we saw the other day. We've talked it through countless times, trying to logically figure out how this was possible. Hopefully someone on here can give us some thoughts and ideas as to what actually happened. So I recently purchased a small bass boat, and my first mate Lejeune and I have been super eager to explore the lake and its islands, as well as learn the fishing around it. We're new to Tennessee. Yesterday, on the 4th of July, we decided to go fishing in this very secluded part of the lake we named No Man's Land because of the low-hanging bridge that prevents boaters from entering the section. My boat can make it underneath because of how small it is, but I've never seen another boat in there. We decided to go deeper into the cove than we've ever been before. As we're slowly trolling down the lake, the path before us splits into 3 forks, and I ask which fork we should take. Lejeune immediately says the middle one, so we continue straight as the water changes from a large lake to a narrow river-like path. This is where a chain of events happened in quick succession, and we've talked through it after the fact to try and recall the order of how this went down. First, we heard a weird vocal-like noise coming from the woods beyond the shoreline, and we both tensed up and felt very uneasy. "What was that?" Lejeune asked. "A dog," I said, as that was the first thing that came to mind. "I don't think that was a dog," Lejeune answered immediately. Then we saw a bird high above us perching on a branch, staring at us. "Maybe it was that bird," Lejeune said. "Yeah, maybe," I answered. I'm not sure when it got into my hand, but at some point I drew my pistol and held it down at my side. Lejeune held the fishing bow. We both had a very weird feeling as we drifted down the river, our eyes glued to the bank. We came to a rotting pine tree that had fallen and was now half submerged in the water, sitting on the shoreline. Then it happened. We hear a very loud, heavy-footed animal running through the woods, getting closer to the water. At first, I thought it was a deer, as it was almost prancing, but as it got closer and louder, we both realized it was, in fact, not a deer. It was a very large, jet-black canine. My brain thought, oh, it must be a coyote, but this was much bigger, like a huge German shepherd. And it was fast, like a black shadow, leaping through the trees and quickly approaching the bank that we were floating across from. It didn't seem to have any texture or details, though, almost like it was flat and blurry. We couldn't see fur or its face and eyes, just the outline of its body and tall wolf-like ears. But it was obviously the body of a canine. Adrenaline started rushing through us, and my brain raced, thinking we were about to have to defend ourselves. It almost looked as if it were charging at us, but it was zigzagging and dodging through the trees toward the exact portion of shoreline we were floating past. We were scared, but the 15 feet of water between our boat and the shoreline gave us some confidence. It would have to swim out to us, and I didn't see that as likely. It continued its leap through the woods and quickly reached our portion of the shoreline. In one majestic, fluid motion, it leapt off the shore and dove into the water right under the half-submerged pine tree in front of us. Stomp, 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 splash. That was it. We held our breath as we waited to hear it swim or move toward us. Small ripples reached our boat from the splash. After the fact, Lejeune swears the splash should have been much bigger for a creature that size. Watch for it to come back up, I whispered. I had never heard of canines being able to submerge themselves underwater, but here it was happening right in front of our eyes. We waited. Nothing. Silence. Just the subtle sound of the ripples made it slowly dissipate. We waited about 20 more seconds, and still nothing. It was almost as if the entire forest had shut off. Silence. Our eyes were glued to the fallen pine tree it dove under. Maybe it's just standing in the water under the tree, Lejeune says. We get the courage to troll the boat a little closer to inspect the tree, but there's nothing. There was no sign of anything. At this point, we're in complete shock. Stunned. It's gone. How could it be gone? How does something that big just vanish, especially a huge creature like that? After 30 more seconds of silence, Lejeune breaks it with, "You saw what I saw, right?" A shiver flashes down my spine. "All of it," I reply. "Really though, what the duck was that?" Lejeune said. I replied, "I think we saw a demon," and we both nervously laughed. We stay floating near the shoreline in shock for at least another 10 minutes, hoping for a sign that we weren't crazy. Lejeune scoured the waters, looking to see if it would come up for air. It never did. How the hell could a big black wolf-like creature disappear into thin air, or water, for that matter? Being skeptics, there has to be a logical explanation for what we saw, but we can't find one. If it had just splashed the water and gotten out again, 1. We would have seen it walk away in whatever direction, and 2. We would have heard it as anything putting weight on the leaves makes a loud noise. But it was just silence. The loudest of silences. We live in Middle Tennessee, if that helps at all. We're still a little shaken up by this. This is 100% true. We are not bullshitting you. Any insight would be much appreciated. Back around 20 years ago, I was visiting my great uncle in the region around Kerrville, Texas. At the time, he was living in his first house in the area before he moved to a retirement community near a small set of trees. The trees were really beautiful, as was the hill country. I was staying with him and my great-aunt for about a week when we went out for an evening to walk his dachshund, as we tended to do in the evenings in general. The walk was uneventful as the sun set, just a normal evening complete with the calls of doves and other wildlife, and the dog was just having a wonderful time. Then, suddenly, all the wildlife went deafeningly silent, and both of us froze, as did the dog. I remember having a distinct sense of unease and fear that I could not quite explain, and the dog was looking directly in a specific area near a streetlight. My eyes turned to where the dog was looking. There was a creature loping through there, a dog-like thing about the size of a large Labrador Dachshund hybrid, save that on the creature's neck there was a head the size of a bear, and the thing was loping up and down in a way that fitted that kind of build. It looked hypnotic in a sense, and I was more terrified than I have ever been with anything else I have ever seen. It gave me a visceral understanding of Lovecraft's idea that things that just look fundamentally wrong are terrifying precisely because the proportions do not fit. That thing was powerfully built, too. The upper limbs in particular were very stout, and the dog remained frozen for another few minutes before we moved back to the house. I'm not sure what precisely that was or if it was a dogman, but it convinced me that something like that could exist. The sudden silence that lasted for a few minutes after it left and the dog just being frozen without even growling or barking still sends chills through me when I remember it. As my only encounter with something like a cryptid, too, it remains something very vivid in my mind, not least because I know how dogs move and what wolves would move like, and whatever that was, it was no natural thing that made sense. Okay. Before I tell my story, I will summarize what a skinwalker is for those who may not know. A skinwalker is a being or entity that kills an organism and uses the skin as a disguise. It is mainly active at night but will observe during the day. Its favorite disguise is that of a human. A skinwalker's most noticeable traits are yellow, glowing eyes, and, if you can see close enough before you're killed, decaying flesh. Anyway, I was heading to a small town in southern Utah with my wife and a couple of friends. We were on our way to see Lee, a friend of mine that we hadn't seen for a long time. We met up with him at his place and decided to hang out at a nearby lake. It was a typical quiet campsite with a fire pit and a couple of logs around it. We had a little picnic there and were exchanging stories and catching up with each other all day. Eventually, one of my friends, Bryce, got tired and decided to fall asleep in the car while the rest of us continued talking. At this point, twilight had fallen. Erica and I were discussing something while my wife and Lee were talking about something else. All of a sudden, my wife and Lee fall silent. Erica and I quickly noticed. We look at them, and Lee says, "Get in the car." I asked him, "What's wrong?" And he says, "There might be a skinwalker out around." Erica and I had no idea what a skinwalker was at the time, so we asked him to explain. After his explanation of what it was, Erica and I, being the only sensible thinkers at the moment, and Bryce, just barely waking up from us jumping in the car, decided we should investigate, believing that it was probably just some kids in a nearby campsite trying to mess with us. We came to the top of the hill that was between our campsite and the next and looked for any likely candidates for the scare. None. All we could see were a couple of trees and some bushes. We even called out, but there was no response. As we were walking back to the campsite, we heard it rustling in the bushes behind us. We look again but see nothing. At this point, we were considering that Lee and my wife may be right. We get back, and it's getting dark fast, so I ask them, "Is there something we can do to keep them away for a little bit?" "Yes," said Lee. "They don't like fire." And him, my wife, and Bryce start working on a fire while me and Erica go down by the lake to collect the 2 liters we had put in the water to keep it cold. Now it's dark, and as Erica and I head back with the sodas, we hear rustling in the bushes beside us. We're both scared. We hurried back and started putting everything back in the car as quickly as possible, while Lee made sure the fire kept burning. After getting everything in the car, I rush over to the fire pit and tell everyone to get in the car as I proceed to stomp the fire out. Right as the fire went out, I heard a blood-curdling scream across the lake. I felt my heart stop. Lee had said skinwalkers are fast and could make a full lap around this lake in a matter of seconds. I jump in the car and yell, "Go!" Right as the engine started and the lights came on, we saw it. Coming out of the bushes in front of us. Glowing yellow eyes and what looked like a zombified coyote with decaying flesh. A skinwalker. We backed up and peeled out of there as fast as we could. This happened 2 years ago, and it still scares me to know how close I came to death. I am honestly amazed that we all survived such a close encounter with this being. Until right now, I have shared this with maybe 4 people because it sounds crazy. This happened back in 2001, so the internet wasn't very helpful back then. I lived in Roanoke, Virginia, in a wooded area with my family. We lived on a big hill surrounded by only woods. I returned home around 2 a.m. and was a young teen at the time. I parked my car and turned on the overhead lamp to roll up a joint. It was a nice night, so I had the windows down and would always hear noises, but I never thought anything because there were tons of animals around. Anyway, I roll up and smoke, and I also pull out my art pad and start to draw, so the overhead lamp is still on, and I have music softly playing for maybe an hour. Finally, I was tired and ready to go inside, so I reached up and turned off the overhead lamp in the car, and when I did, I could now obviously see outside the car now, and directly in front of me, maybe 12 feet, slumped down in front of my brother's Jeep, is this pale, skinny, long-armed, and long-legged creature. It was looking right at me, like it had been there a while. It was also intelligent enough to know that once I cut that inside lamp off, I could now see outside, and I knew I could see it. I only saw it for maybe 3 seconds until it realized it, and it bolted to the back of the house like a cheetah. I was scared and stuck in place by what I saw. I was too scared to get out and ended up driving around for hours until the sun came up. I returned home and finally went inside. I immediately that day tried to rationalize and asked my dad and brother where they were outside at 3 a.m. last night, to which they laughed and said, "Hey, no. That house always scared me and my brothers." We actually called the cops another time because we thought someone was trying to rob the place because we kept hearing noises on the back deck door one night. This sighting I had of that creature was burned in my brain in 2024, so almost 24 years later, I'm still curious about what I saw. Even more crazy as the years went by and the internet became what it is. I remember the first time I came across a picture of what some call a skinwalker. And my heart stopped. It's that famous picture where it slumped down on all fours in the exact position I saw it in that night. They moved the same way they said, and their limbs were long, just like in those stories. It felt good to know I wasn't alone and crazy. But there are still so many questions. I felt I would share in the hopes that maybe others have seen this thing and will share. We are not alone on this planet. Are they aliens? Whatever it was, it didn't harm me. My window was down the entire time. It could have snuck up on me and easily harmed me. It seemed to only watch me. Also, it happened so fast to me that my face had a small mouth and big eyes, and I didn't see a nose. Very pale, though. I was at my friend's house, who were triplets, for a birthday party. It was pretty late in the day, around 8, but it was summertime, so it was still pretty light out but dusky. The only ones left at the party were me, the triplets, and my cousin. We had been inside for whatever reason, then decided to go back outside and play. The boys, one of the triplets and my cousin, started to chase me and the other 2 triplets into the woods with Nerf guns, just typical kid stuff. Typically, the triplets would not go too deep into the woods. There was a self-made trail they would follow that looped behind their property into the neighbor's property. The neighbor had a horse, so they would go into the horse area, hop the fence, and it was a straight path back up to their house and driveway. Since the boys were chasing us, we went deeper into the woods than normal and eventually lost them. We girls were just wandering around, talking quietly, and enjoying being outside. I got distracted by something, I'm not sure what, and got separated from the girls. I wasn't too far from them, as I could still hear them talking. I heard rustling and looked up to see something that bears the closest resemblance to it, the crawler. Except it wasn't crawling, it was standing straight up, about 7 feet tall. Its skin was grayish white, and its face didn't move at all, it just stared. I was so scared, I didn't even scream, I just ran back towards where the girls were and urged them to go back towards their house. I have never seen one since, and I did not know what I had seen until I did some research on cryptid sightings and found that whatever I had seen most closely resembled a crawler. I have never told anyone about this except my boyfriend, as I did not want to seem crazy. For geographical context, I live in the area of Kentucky that borders Ohio and Indiana. Needless to say, it was creepy as hell. Back in the 1970s, it was not uncommon for people to travel across the country each summer in their car or van. So naturally, my parents thought nothing of packing up their 3 children in a basic van with little more than one of those AAA trip tips you could get if you were a member of AAA. We traveled every summer. We'd gone camping in Mexico for a month one year, camping through Canada the next year, and so on. In 1975, however, my parents wanted to cover the eastern seaboard using our van as our means of transportation. We came up the coast from South Carolina to North Carolina and onward up to New York State. That's where it happened. My parents were cheap. Maybe that's not fair to say, my dad was a social worker and my mom was a stay-at-home mom, so we did things on a budget. Frequently, we would just pull over at a rest area, do our business in nature, and bunk down for the night right in the van. So this one night, we are in the mountains of New York, stopping at a rest area that is basically a dirt and gravel parking lot. It was heavily forested, and we were the only family parked there for the night. If you're wondering how we all fit in the van, my parents were ingenious and strung hammocks for me and my sister. My parents and my baby sister then slept on the floor of the van, using sleeping bags. So my sister and I are both lying in our hammocks. It's late, and everyone below us on the floor is sound asleep. Our heads are near the rear of the van, so we can see directly out of the front window into the forest. I'm laying there, just looking, when I see 2 large orange orbs appear in front of the driver's seat. I know that no one is parked there because I peed in the woods in front of the van less than an hour ago. I lay there silently, trying to figure out what the heck it was. I even looked out the rear of the van. We had tie-up curtains in our van, but it was so completely dark out that my parents didn't consider closing the curtains. Now, at this point, I'm not sure if my older sister is sleeping in the hammock next to me. I'm just looking at these orbs, and frankly, I'm too terrified to make a sound. I start to make out the outline of a massive head. It looks like whatever it is standing on our front bumper. I move beyond terror and muster the gumption to start to cry. To my surprise, my older sister is awake and starts crying along with me. I begin calling for my mom. Internally, my mind is wondering whether what I'm seeing is scarier than the spanking I'm going to get for waking my parents for nothing. My mother is not budging, but neither is my dad. At this point, I would be okay with my dad yelling at me for waking him up, maybe it would scare this thing away. I start howling louder, calling out for both of them to please, wake up. Both remain sound asleep, along with my baby sister, who is sleeping between them. My sister joins me in calling out to both of them. The front driver's door opens. But the dome light does not go on. Whatever it is, it moves into her car and is seated in the driver's seat. I can clearly see an outline of it, and it turns around and looks at me. I would say that the orbs of its eyes were as big as grapefruits. Bright orange. My older sister and I both react the same. We roll out of our hammocks, almost in sync with one another. And free fall, slamming on top of each of our parents. Neither parent stirs even a little, in spite of being slammed into in the middle of the night. No matter what, I can't wake anyone up. I remember lying next to my mom and crying. And then everything goes blank. My next memory is waking up in the morning next to my mom, and practically squishing my baby sister, and being scolded by my dad for being on the floor instead of in my hammock. I am certain nobody woke up that night. But here is the thing, the front driver's side door cracked open in the morning. My parents accuse us of getting out of the van in the middle of the night to go pee and forgetting to shut the door. I never left that man that night, nor did anyone else. Plus, I am absolutely certain the doors were not only shut but were locked when we went to bed that night. I don't know what exactly I saw. But I have researched. My best guess is that I experienced what is referred to as Mothman. My sister has told me that she concurs with me. I feel foolish, I am a scientist. Yet I know what I saw. And I am not the only one to have seen what I saw. The first time we talked about it, my talented, artistic older sister sketched what she saw. I know I saw the same thing. That's my story. It's 100% true. I am not a budding young writer, just someone who wants to share her story and hopes that I might gather more information from those of you listening to this. So please let me know. My ex was stationed at Camp Lejeune, and after he and I split up, I stayed in coastal Carolina for a few years until the recession hit hard in the area in 2008, when I packed up and moved back west to where my family is originally from. I loved it out there. My son and my younger daughter still live there. I can't go into fine details because it's not my story, but I think my then 10-year-old son saw one in the woods on Camp Lejeune while he and his little buddies were out playing one evening. He was so freaking terrified that I had to have our pastor come over at 11 p.m. at night to talk to him and comfort him. He kept talking about a giant black dog that was stalking him, going from tree to tree where it would stand up, leaning against the tree to stare at him. We had pet dogs, big hound dogs, so I couldn't understand why he was so scared. I asked if the dog had tried to bite him or had chased him, and he said no. So, at the time, I had no explanation of why he was upset. After hearing about Dogman these last couple of years, I began to wonder if that's what he saw, so I asked him. He is nearly 29 years old now. He says he doesn't know what I am talking about, which I find strange because, at the time, it was so traumatic for him, whatever it was that he saw, that he stayed up all night crying. I've since listened to a couple of stories from Marines who claim they have seen them at Camp Lejeune, too. So I wonder. This was about 23 years ago, and I had no clue what a dogman was, and I didn't believe in anything supernatural back then. I was hunting wild hogs in one of the southernmost areas of the Great Dismal Swamp. This is far south of the wildlife refuge, where it ends at the Albemarle Sound in eastern North Carolina. I had put my boat in the water at a friend's house about a half hour by water from where I went into the swamp. This was in late November, so it was pretty cold and really overcast, and it gets dark around 5 or so. It was about noon when I tied up and got out of the boat. The first hour or so was pretty uneventful. I was working my way inland. Some of this part of the swamp can be walked through when the tide is low, and it's just marshy with deeper canals and bogs scattered about, but there aren't any trails, marked paths, or anything else, so you really have to pay attention to where you're going, and you definitely need a compass since you can't see the sun. It's pretty dark in there, even on bright and sunny days. I was back in there for about 2 hours, looking for signs of hogs. I could tell some had been back there at some point, but it had been a while. I got a little further in and started smelling what I had thought was a boar. It's rutting season, and male wild hogs have a very distinct smell. It's musky and kind of fermented, mixed with old poop and urine. It's kind of hard to explain if you've never smelled it before. However, this was different. It was musky, but more like an outside dog that's soaking wet. I stopped to look and listen, and after 10 or so minutes, I started hearing snuffling and breathing that came and went. After a bit, I started to hear some growling. I started to get a little freaked out because it didn't sound like a hog, and it sounded big. I stopped again, knelt down, waited, and looked around. Where I was, the brush was pretty thick, so I really couldn't see more than 20 or so feet in any direction. That's when I started seeing movement. It definitely wasn't moving like a hog. It was kind of low walking, crouched down, but not on all fours, and I was only getting glimpses of it, and it would stop. It was probably about 40 feet away. This is when I actually start getting scared. I was born in northeastern Kentucky and spent most of my free time as a kid in the woods, camping, and riding dirt bikes. I have always been comfortable, even in the deep woods, so when I moved to NC, I fell in love with the swamp. This is the first time I think I have ever felt real, actual fear. I had a Mossberg 590 shotgun full of 3 inches buckshot but no extra shells and no pistol. The 590 also has a bayonet lug, so I took out the bayonet and put it on. I started backing up, not taking my eyes off where I had last seen whatever it was. A few minutes later, I hear it again, a little further over to my left. I'm probably about 3/4 of a mile into the swamp. It doesn't seem very far, but the terrain doesn't make for really quick movement. This goes on for about another 20 minutes while I backtrack out as fast as I can, and I'm still hearing it and catching glimpses of movement, and the smell is getting stronger. After a bit, I realize that this thing has gotten between me and the way I came in from my boat, and I'm starting to panic. I try to start getting further away from it and heading in the right direction, and then I see it again, and it's standing up, and it's pretty damn tall. It was still back in the brush, so I couldn't really make out any details as it was dark as hell back there. I wanted to cry and run, but I knew that was bad. It didn't seem like it wanted to get into the water, so I started wading through the canal and headed back towards my boat. I started to put some distance between it and myself, so I got back on hard ground to move a little faster, but I can still hear it snuffling and growling and moving through the brush, but it's not close anymore. I made it back to my boat, and I'm soaking wet and freezing, but I thank God I made it out of there, just in time as it was getting foggy and starting to drizzle. I had never been that scared in my life. I made it back to my buddy's house to tell him what happened, and I can tell he knows something when I tell him where I went. He brings me in and gives me some hot coffee with a big slug of bourbon in it. When I calm down, he takes me to the other house out back on his property, where his granddad lives. I'd met his granddad before, but he had always been kind of standoffish to me. I found out later that he just had really bad PTSD from Korea. My buddy and his family had lived in that area since after the Civil War. I think his great-grandfather had been a slave around there, but that's a story for another day. I guess what I mean to say is that his family had history in that area and knew the place a lot better than me. After I told his granddad what happened, he stood up, looked me in the eye, and said, "Don't go back in there. You're lucky you made it out. That's where the big dogs live." I left, went home, and slept for about 18 hours. I tried to forget about that experience and started to believe I was just seeing shit, freaking myself out. I eventually forgot all about it until a few years ago, when a video of a dog encounter came up in my YouTube feed. I was curious what the hell a dogman was, so I started listening to it, and that whole experience came flooding back to mind. It was very similar to what happened to me. I started looking into it, and there have been other sightings and encounters in eastern NC. So that's my story. I'm 44 now and still live in coastal NC, but I haven't been back anywhere close to that area. I still hunt and love the outdoors and the swamp, but I don't go too far in anymore. So a year had passed since I fully realized they were real, and I'd gotten a couple friends on board, at least enough to go camping and see what we could find. We ended up at a campground in Lost Creek Wilderness, a little ways NW of Pikes Peak, Colorado. We really didn't expect to find anything on this first trip, and we were skeptical of the signs we came across until the morning, but we did notice a couple things. In an aspen grove nearby, we found an aspen tree that was broken off at its base. Sorry for the lack of banana scale in these photos, they're a few years old. Nearby was this area of matted grass. We also found a few broken off trunks, 8 to 10 feet tall aspen trees, sort of hidden laying behind some rocks. Later that night, sitting around the fire, one of my friends suddenly said, "Whoa, I just saw a flash of light over there." We decided it must have been a headlight shining through the trees from the road in the distance, but I turned around to look in the direction he'd been looking. Then I saw it too. A bright yellow-white circle of light appeared to peek out from behind a tree some 20 feet away, briefly coming into view before going back behind the tree. We again chalked it up to being a headlight, but examining the line of sight during the daytime, I don't think that's possible. The road is quite a ways away in that direction and obscured by many pine trees. If visible, a headlight would be scattered by the pines at least. What I saw was sharply defined and circular. I also definitely felt watched, but I wasn't into trusting those feelings much at the time, so I brushed it off. The following morning, we did a little hike, and as we were getting back to camp and walking along the creek, someone noticed this stick structure on the other side of the creek. For an idea of scale, the tallest tree in the arch is probably 9 to 10 feet. It's not possible to get over there without wading through cold, deep, fast-moving water. We're kind of dumbfounded by this sight, because not only how, but why would a person do that? And we're making the connection to the broken off trees stashed on our side of the creek, not yet placed, and again, why would a person break the tree rather than using an axe? We stand in silence for a while, just thinking, and as I'm staring at this spot in the middle of the creek, a rock splashes directly in the center of my field of view. I asked if my friend saw it, and he said he had. We both thought it was weird. Later, though, he confessed he hadn't actually seen the rock I saw but had seen one earlier that I didn't notice and just didn't say anything. Our attitude after that first trip was sort of hesitantly amazed. We really hadn't expected anything and weren't really certain yet, but we couldn't deny that we had a lot of reason to go back to that exact spot, which we did 2 days later. This time we did a night hike around midnight. We got a nearby ridge that overlooks a steep bowl-shaped slope a little ways away. I'd stopped a bit below the crest to catch my breath, so I was the last one to reach the top. I reached the top, and almost immediately we all heard a powerful crack, like lightning from the middle of the other slope, followed by the sound of a tree hitting the ground. A tree broke on a perfectly clear, windless night, right as the last member of our group came into earshot of it. I want to leave my subjective interpretation out as much as possible, but this was an incredible moment in my life. The apprehension from the hike through dark trees instantly vanished, replaced by awe. God, what a mighty sound. It was like they were telling us, don't worry, we're all the way over here, but don't come any closer. I remember my good friend saying, I thought it would be scary, but it's just cool, and we were all a little slack-jawed and teary-eyed. We tried to knock on their door, but the tree breaking was the only thing we heard that night. The next morning, 2 of us went on a sunrise hike, thinking we'd stop at the same ridge, but we ended up going all the way up the peak right above the campground. On our way down, we found another stick structure. I think I caught a glimpse of one of them peeking out at us from behind a tree while we were hanging out near that structure, but it was far enough away and obscured by pine needles that I couldn't be sure. There were 2 eyes glowing a pale blue in the early morning darkness, framed by dark brown, with a ring of light brown hair around the face. I could barely make it out, but the thing that kept me staring at it was the peeking motion, 1 eye, back behind the tree, 2 eyes, back behind the tree. This was accompanied by a strange sounding chirping noise from that location and another location off to its right. I eventually began to feel very uncomfortable, like we were outstaying our welcome, and insisted that we head back down. I live on the south shore of Massachusetts, in the Bridgewater Triangle, which has to make a difference. This is from a while ago, over a year ago, but my friend asked me about it, which makes me want to ask about it. So somewhere in between 8 and 10 at night, I was with my friends driving in the high-tension lines, which is an open field. I am driving my truck, and I have 3 people in the cab and about 6 people in the bed of the truck. I was new to the woods we were in, so they had me go down a dirt road into the actual woods and away from the field. It goes to a small sand pit with a spot for a fire. It's a single road in and a single road out. We get to the end of the road, and it was my first time down there, so I was looking around to see where to go. I look to my right out the windows that we had open, and about 40 to 50 feet in the distance, I see something, but I don't realize it, and I think I'm just seeing things. So I turn back, and all of the people in the bed start yelling at the same time. I look back and see what it is again. It looked like it was 7 to 8 feet tall, very skinny, so much so that I could see its ribs, and it was sort of furry. I freak out and step on the gas to turn around, and my truck is very loud, so if it were an animal, it most likely would have been scared off when I hit the gas, but it kept walking towards the truck. I don't know how real this is, but 2 of my friends in the bed of the truck claim that when they pulled out their phones to start recording, both phones died as soon as they tried to record. The only reason my friend texted me is because apparently one of his friends was back there, and it was at a different time, which I didn't know about. What could this have been? I am stumped for answers. The story I'm about to tell you happened a few months ago. It still chills me to the bone. I never would have thought something like this would happen to me. But yet, it did. I turned on the TV and walked into the kitchen. The microwave started beeping, meaning my bag of popcorn was done cooking. I took it out, grabbed the butter from the counter, and poured it on. The butter sizzled down through the kernels to the bottom of the bag. I went over to the couch and sat down. The TV was turned to a breaking news report. Hundreds of dogs from all around Ukiah, New Mexico, seem to have suddenly gone missing. The Nevada Department of Conservation and Natural Resources says that they are looking into why these disappearances are occurring. More on this at 12, said the newscaster. I threw my bowl of uneaten popcorn in the trash and decided to go to bed. It was getting pretty late, and I had a meeting early in the morning. I went upstairs and into my room. My dog, Laika, a large golden retriever, was lying on the ground. She looked up at me with sad, doggy eyes before dropping her head back down onto the carpet. "Hey buddy," I said. "What's the matter?" Of course, my dog just laid there aimlessly, staring at the wall. I shrugged and went into the bathroom to get ready for bed. I hopped in a quick shower, brushed my teeth, and climbed in bed. Staring up at the ceiling, I emptied my mind and drifted off to sleep. Boom. 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 The loud pounding on the door jolted me awake. I shot upright and looked over at the clock. 3:33 a.m. God damn it, I muttered as I pulled the covers off me. I looked over at the floor where Leica was lying, only to see it was now vacant. I sighed and walked out the open door into the hallway. It was dark, and not because there were no lights on. Something felt off. The air felt thicker, no, heavier, than normal. I rounded the corner to the stairs when I was abruptly hit with this awful smell. It smelled like rotten meat. I pulled my shirt up over my face and covered my nose, but I could still smell it. I walked down the stairs and looked around for Leica, but she was nowhere to be seen. Confused, I walked over to open the large front door. Just as I was about to open it, something stopped me. I felt a chill run from the back of my neck all the way down my spine. I shuddered, and I opened the door. There was nobody there. I looked around my empty front yard. Then, I stepped out and scanned the tree line in the back of the yard. There was nothing out there. Slowly, I closed the front door and stepped back inside. As I turned around, I was surprised to see Leica suddenly standing at the door. I leaned down to pet her but stopped. There was something off about her. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but then I started to notice. Her ears were standing straight up, which she never does. Drool and slobber poured from her open mouth, which revealed her jagged, pointed teeth, which appeared sharper than normal. I looked into her eyes. Something wasn't right about them. They looked dark and empty, but most noticeably, they looked human. She began to bark, and I stepped back. Tripping, I fell onto the ground and scurried backwards. Her bark echoed through the house. It sounded off, almost as if it were her bark, but at the same time, there was a deeper sound to it as well. Something is not natural. Something demonic. Suddenly, her head snapped sharply left, and she looked at me. She looked right at me with those black, lifeless eyes. Then, just as soon as she appeared, Leica was gone. She stood up, looked at the door, then back at me, before wandering down the hall towards the kitchen. Terrified, I ran upstairs and closed the door. I walked past Leica, now lying on the floor of my room, and got back in bed to go to sleep. It wasn't until I had just started to drift off to sleep that I realized I had seen Leica go down the hall, not into my room. Whatever I had seen downstairs was not my dog. It was something else entirely. Flash forward 6 months. One of my clients, Dr. Ashki Dayan, who was a Native American man from the local Navajo tribe, came into my office one Monday afternoon. Before we started talking business, I had him introduce himself to me and tell me a few stories about himself. One of the stories he told caught my attention. He told a story about an encounter he had with a tribal creature known as a skinwalker. He said that these creatures, skinwalkers, were evil creatures summoned by Navajo witches that had the ability to transform into any animal they pleased. He also described the awful, wretched odor that they give off. I was shocked. Now, positive that I had an encounter with a skinwalker that fateful night, I jumped back from my desk, running to the bathroom. I had no clue what to do. Until this point, I had been told my whole life that monsters weren't real. Now, I know that's just not true. Monsters are real. All you have to do is know where to look. It happened in Houston, Ms., and my story still leaves me perplexed to this day. In 1978, I was 8 years old, but I can still remember this as if it happened yesterday. We were 1 week into the beginning of the summer break. Me and my brother being 3 years older than I, were so excited that we didn't have to go to bed at 8 o'clock anymore. You know, it's summer break and all. Lucky for us, a man had come to our door around 7 p.m. He asked my dad, I think my dad knew him, to give him a ride down to the rodeo that was on the outskirts of town. Because there, he had gotten his new job. Doing what? I didn't know or care. We begged Dad to let us come along. We loved riding in the back of the truck, especially at night, and this was a full moonlit night. Reluctantly, Dad said yes. But on our way back home, after dropping off this man, that is when things got weird. As the truck approached this big pinkish house, this house had a huge yard, and dividing this yard was a fence to an even bigger hilly pasture. Lit by the moonlight, I saw what appeared to be an enormous dog running down a hilly pasture toward our truck. I was so captivated by the size of this dog. Not really a big deal, being that it was 1978 and it was commonplace to see dogs chasing vehicles. However, when this dog reached the fence, it leapt over it and landed on all fours, only to rise up on 2 legs, flawlessly continuing to run like a man, in second, meeting and keeking parallel with our truck. Keep in mind that Dad was driving. I was sitting on the toolbox in the back of the truck near the creature, and my brother was next to me, who was somehow fixated on the opposite side of the road. I was literally paralyzed with fear, only able to close and reopen my eyes and shake my head. This creature was covered with grayish hair from head to toe, appearing to have breasts with black eyes shimmering in the moonlight. Its eye dotted at my oblivious dad driving, then at my brother, but then to focus on me. It beckons me to come to it with my left hand. And I then close my eyes, shaking my head furiously in order to wake myself from this nightmare. The creature, seeing that, as if to say, I am real, without ever leaving the border of the yard, step under the only night light on that entire road. This light was at least 20 feet up. Wow, those few minutes feel like hours. This thing's body covered 8 or 9 feet of the nightlight's pole. The most frightening thing was the not quite human face that seemed to be mouthing words to me as it continued beckoning me with a very frustrating expression. It looked nothing like an ape and nothing like a man except for the wide human nose and its lip movements. It could have easily grabbed me from the back of the truck, being that the border of the yard was at least 20 feet from the road. It just continued beckoning until the truck got out of sight. I didn't regain full mobility and speech from being fear-stricken until the truck pulled into our driveway. I told my folks what I saw. Dad said he didn't see anything. However, my parents, being super religious, knew that I wouldn't be so foolish as to tell them some outlandish lie. They just said it was a spirit and that I needed to pray. However, the question that my mama asked my brother racks my brain until this day. She had asked him, "You were sitting right next to me, why didn't you see anything?" My brother said, in the field on the opposite side of the road, he was frightened by the giant white African loin chasing the truck. At 8 years old, I had watched a lot of PBS networks, and New Mississippi, especially Houston, had no African lions. So my question will always be, were there two creatures, and was this an ambush? The following happened to me about a year and a half ago, after the corona pandemic began. I'm actually a broadcast engineer, but I got hooked on emerging drone technology several years ago. I learned how to fly them and also started modifying drones, equipping them with cameras, lasers, and infrared sensors, and using them to photograph farmers' fields, construction sites, and other terrain, for example. In the meantime, I have turned this into a business that takes me all over Germany, but also to Austria, Switzerland, and France. I'm on the road almost 250 days a year. A year and a half ago, I got another assignment. I should come to Bavaria, near the border with Austria. There I was to photograph and scan the shore of a lake near the Ruschenkopf, a beautiful mountain, with a high-resolution camera and a laser scanner for an environmental protection organization. From where I live, this was a nearly 6-hour drive. The nearest settlement is only 6 kilometers from the Ruschenkopf, but with all the hills and mountains and forests and dirt roads, it feels like the middle of nowhere. On my way to the lake, I stopped at an alpine hut where I had put up. This was not a hotel, but rather a small inn with 3 small rooms that an old couple rented out. They were 2 very nice people. I needed to get my luggage to the room and then go by car to the lake. Around noon, I was there. It was a cool but beautiful day, and only a few thin veil clouds were in the sky, which was perfect for taking pictures of the lake shore with the camera drone. It's not a big lake, but it still took a few hours to capture everything. Then it was the drone's turn with the laser scanner. Before I knew it, it was evening and dark, and I couldn't see anything. I was still missing the northern foothills of the shore, but that wasn't a problem since I budgeted 2 days for the job anyway. I packed the drones into the car, which was parked a short distance from the shore. Only then did I realize that it was completely dark by now. One hardly realizes it, but away from the cities, there is total darkness at night. I could hardly see my hand in front of my eyes, but I could hear all the more. It rustled, and the wind breathed through the patch of forest that enclosed the lake. It was beautiful, but also damn scary, and I now wanted to drive to the alpine hut as quickly as possible. I got in the car and drove off. The journey should take about half an hour. At least, that's how long it took me to get from there to the lake. But on this dark night, I didn't dare to drive as fast as in the daytime because the roads were not tarred but only gravel roads, and everywhere was forest, in which all kinds of animals are at home. I was on the road for about 10 minutes once. I went over a very narrow gravel road downhill and into the forest when I suddenly stepped on the brakes, because in front of the car was something in the headlights. At first, I thought it was a wild boar with his piglets. Or maybe some rabbits. But no, it was something else. About 4 or 5 meters in front of the hood stood 3 little creatures. They looked like little human beings. Maybe a foot high, no more. They were staring directly in my direction, and their eyes were twinkling in the headlights, not like a cat's eyes, it was more of a dull twinkle that their eyes threw back. The little creatures were not naked but wore clothes. Small dirty pants, a poncho of some sort, and one of them held a small stick that he leaned on. It was a bizarre sight. And although these three beings did not look threatening in any way, I was suddenly overcome with incredible panic and fear. I don't know why, but I pressed the horn of the car. And amidst the forest and the dark night, it sounded incredibly loud, so that I frightened myself. The little creatures also suddenly flinched and scurried off the road and into the forest. When I didn't see them anymore, I drove on. I had to force myself not to speed and kept glancing in the rearview mirror, where at one moment I thought I recognized two shimmering eyes looking after me from the road. It felt like an eternity when I finally arrived at the mountain pasture, where the old gentleman greeted me. He could see that I was completely lost and asked me what was going on. I told him he wouldn't believe me if I told him what I saw. But he told me to call his bluff, and I felt an urgent need to tell him what had happened to me. So I told him. He didn't laugh, didn't make a face, but just nodded in agreement and said that what I had seen was known by everyone in that area. It was the little people who lived in the forest and deep in the mountains. Few would have seen them, but almost everyone in the area knew someone who had had an encounter with them. I did not have a good feeling when I went to the lake the next day to finish my work. And again, I had the feeling that someone was watching me from the woods. I hurried and was glad that it was still a day before I could leave again. To preface the story and where it takes place, I grew up in the Huron region of Ontario. For those not familiar, it's about a 3-hour drive directly west from Toronto, where I now live, on the shore of Lake Huron. Not far from the area the tales of the Black Donnellys are from for you dark history lovers. During my time in high school, there was one teacher who talked about his experiences in a small forested place called Lob's Bush. Although I wasn't very familiar with it at the time, it was known by a fair number of locals as a very haunted place in the area or where people had had unexplainable but startlingly similar encounters. This teacher was very outspoken about his experiences in that bush, but also about his steadfast trust in being a non-believer in the paranormal or supernatural, which in turn made him, of all people, the most fascinating to hear it from. He always ends his stories or answers questions with, "I don't believe it, I can't explain it, I'm just telling you what happened." A few years later, in the winter of 2017, both after having him as my teacher in high school and having since moved away to attend my first year of university, I came back to my hometown for my winter break to spend some time with family and catch up with my friend group. For anyone familiar with the small town experience, our favorite activity was the age-old classic of buying a terrible number of cheap reservation cigarettes, hopping in one of our friends' terribly run-down beater cars, and then smoking, chatting, and playing the worst music ever conceived until either the smokes or the gas tank runs out. We were all hovering around 16 to 18, so this was just the most fun degenerate thing we could do. On top of finally having a break from all my university coursework, this was the first time seeing these friends in a couple of months, so we were all excited to be one big group again. I won't bore you with all the earlier antics of the evening, but where this story picks up is after driving around catching up for a few hours, we pit stop at a random bush trail so some of us could smoke some weed. As we started walking down one of the trails, I remember feeling a very stark change in the atmosphere around us. I didn't really want to express my feelings to ruin the mood, but I definitely felt the need to be on high alert. I've never really had a way to describe the physical feeling, apart from my chest feeling heavy, but somehow it was very clear that something was watching us and did not want us there. Every few steps, I needed to look back to make sure something wasn't stalking us. All we had were our phone flashlights, which had a very short distance. The way the trail sat in the bush, it was all new trees, so they curled over the path to almost form a tunnel. It looked as if we had walked into the maw of a massive creature, slowly making our way down its throat. We only made it about a few hundred meters before realizing that the calm night was turning into a winter storm. We all agreed to go back to the car and start making our way home before it got any worse. By the time we made it back to the car, the trees were swinging wildly in the wind, and the snow made it hard to see the next couple of feet in front of us. Once we made it to the car, we started to drive back to the closest town so as to stay at a friend's place to wait out the storm. While driving, the weather continued getting worse until the snow practically blinded us. While going around a notable halfway there turn, we found out that our estimate of how far to turn the car wasn't enough and felt the car's momentum stall and slide sideways into the ditch. After a short period of us hurling claims of backseat driving and general frustrations, we ended up staying in the ditch for around 5 hours before being rescued by local police and driven the rest of the way into town. During our time in the ditch, I talked about how I felt while walking in the woods. We all agreed with the feeling of knowing we shouldn't be there, and none of us spoke up until now. Only after that did our friend in the driver's seat, and the only one familiar with these particular back roads, inform us that we were in fact walking through Lob's Bush. Fast forward some time to, I believe, my second semester reading week. I'm back home with my friends and back to our same old acts. After a particularly good night of catching up, we decided to go revisit Lob's Bush, as none of us had been there since getting caught in the ditch, and the weather was already warm this month with far less snow. I remember feeling almost excited to go back. Rather than dark, impenetrable clouds and snow, tonight the moon was out, and we barely needed flashlights to see where we were going. We parked the car in the same spot and grabbed all necessary smoking apparatus and a pack of cigarettes for the driver and me to share, as, of course, neither time are we dumb enough to get our designated driver high. As we started walking into the trail, I started realizing landmarks that I had missed from my first time there. With the moonlight making everything more visible, I walked through the same threshold as before and was pleasantly surprised that I didn't feel like I was watched or unwelcome to walk through. After a point, I had almost forgotten that I was in the infamous woods and was enjoying a late night walk through the forest, laughing with my friends. After walking further down the trail, we finally came to an opening. On the right side of the trail, the trees had parted out to showcase the edge of a field, nicely lit by the moonlight. On the left side, the bush clears out, so there is a lovely section of grass and light foliage parting to show a small stream cutting through. It looked like a naturally made auditorium, with the stream cutting through like a main walkway, sparse trees, so plenty of seating for an audience, and the trees opening and leading down to the farmer's field as the stage. In all honesty, I had completely forgotten we were there to smoke and was just enamored with how pretty it was. As we found a spot to stop and ready our lights to smoke, one friend had the bright idea to exclaim, "Yo, I forgot I've got a Roman candle." As we all turned to look, they had already gotten their lighter out and were proceeding to light the candle. Again, we were late teens, we were idiots. She proceeds to point the candle towards the big clearing in the field, every once in a while moving it around so it is not all shooting in the same spot. Going higher and higher into the air, she finally points it in the opposite direction towards the wood. With surprising accuracy, none of the shots actually hit anything before going out until one finally hits a tree near the stream and spirals into the woods where we can't see it. Within no more than a second's time, this blood-curdling scream comes from the exact place the Roman candle bounced into the woods beyond our view. We all completely froze, unsure of what to make of it as the scream continued on for a worrisome amount of time. I can only describe it as a cross between a deeper version of a howler monkey's roar and an ear-ringing whine like an elk's bugle going higher in pitch as it kept screaming. I remember my ears vibrating from how loud it was. I wanted to cover them, but we were all frozen in place by it. Finally, one of us snapped into reality, yelled "Run!" and bolted off towards the farmer's field. We all, in turn, started running away from the ongoing scream from within the woods. As we were running, the scream finally stopped after about 10 seconds of constant noise. There was no breath or change in the scream apart from pitch. It was able to yell at that volume for longer than I've heard any animal do. Before we could even think, we heard a heavy rustling in the woods as whatever it was took a deep inhale to scream again. The inhale was just as terrifying, sounding like an alligator's bellow mixed with a hyena's laugh. I know both sounds I'm describing are from exhaling, but you could tell this was a guttural, full-chested, and preparatory inhale before screaming again. Unlike the first scream, which almost sounded reactionary, I was surprised by the Roman candle almost hitting it. This was clearly an angry roar. Whatever it was really ducking big, with the lungs to prove it, and now moving towards us. It was even louder, and what I could only assume was now pointed towards us. Even though we were all heavy smokers at the time, we all ran as fast as we possibly could without looking back, absolutely terrified by the second, continuous roar that was now gaining on us. After about 15 seconds, the scream stopped abruptly. It took us a second to realize the noise was gone. We turned around to see that we'd made it out of the woods and onto the field. We only looked back briefly to see that we had put about 50 to 100 meters between us and the edge of the bush. Even before we could really think straight, we shakily agreed to make our way to the closest road to make our way back to the front of the bush to find where we parked. It was only once we got to the road, and caught our smoked out breath, did one of us finally ask if we all heard and felt that. We all talked briefly but were too on edge to actually converse. About 20 minutes later, we finally made it back to the road and had the car in sight. We all started to calm down as we had some time to process and let the adrenaline wear off. We unlocked the car and all got into our respective seats with our bags. None of us had the time to take it off before the first scream happened. As the driver finally turned the car on and the headlights flooded the woods in front of us, the front passenger just screamed, "Drive, drive, drive." The driver, without looking, cranked the car into reverse and turned around to back out quickly and go down the back road as fast as he could beside the bush. The friend who screamed started to freak out all over again. I was sitting directly behind him with my hand on his shoulder from the back seat. As we tried to ask what was wrong, I was looking over my shoulder to look into the woods. I genuinely felt like time had slowed down as I looked over, with the same feeling of something watching me like my first time in the woods. As the trees passed by, I could clearly make out two fully open eyes reflecting back at me. I could clearly make out two full reflective circles. I was completely frozen and couldn't look away. I couldn't tell if the eyes were locked on me or the whole vehicle, or even what light they were reflecting off of as we were driving beside the woods. They were clearly further back into the woods by a couple of meters, so I couldn't make out how tall it was, but I could very easily see they were attached to a head much larger and taller than a human. I completely forgot about comforting the passenger in front of me and instead tried to turn and see it for longer through the back window as we kept driving, but I had completely lost the visual. I couldn't even make a sound, but my mind was racing. The longer I sat, the longer I wondered how the hell it got to where I could see it after we had sped away from the parking spot. I don't know how much it saw from the car, but I know it saw me. It saw all of us in those woods. I don't know how to describe it other than that I was fully prey, and whatever it was a predator that knows me now. After driving for a while on our way back to a friend's farm, we were all able to speak about what had happened. We all heard the same noises, heard the same rustling, heard the same far too long screams, and finally, the other passenger and I both agreed on seeing the same wide eyes staring at us. Neither of us got a good look at what it was, but both agreed that it was staring at us and was too big to make out. That passenger also made a comment that, even though it was a couple of meters into the woods when he saw it, it had to be much bigger than a human. After a couple of hours more of conversing about it, we all finally felt comfortable driving back to our respective homes. Every couple of months when we'd see each other, we'd make certain to each other that we all saw the same thing, as we wanted to make sure none of us were truly losing it mentally. I sat through the events of this story for about a year, not really sure who to tell or who would believe any of us, for that matter. Once I finally felt comfortable talking and researching things similar, I came to the personal conclusion that it might be something along the lines of a skinwalker and started looking further into stories about it. As there was so much talk of people having similar encounters or strange happenings in Lob's Bush, I really wanted to entertain and research any and all possibilities. On top of that, although I was raised somewhat Christian in school, it was never a dogma I really followed or was heavy into the idea of other powers until this happened. For me, if this was real and it happened to me, I couldn't disprove anything, and it has vastly changed the way I look at any form of religion or spiritual beliefs. Through friends and a few events, I know a fair number of indigenous groups and older members that I felt believed enough of the old ways to tell this story. All three elders essentially said the same thing, along the very blunt line of yep, that sounds like a skinwalker, and a few shared similar encounters that other friends and family have had. Only within the last 2 years, I think, have I talked to a few more people about it, and one friend finally recommended that I Google what a skinwalker sounded like. I finally looked online and heard some very similar sounds that sent the same it's-watching chills down my spine. I felt that, on top of everything else, was enough confirmation for me. To this day, I have started my own spiritual path with respect to the lands, and especially now being on Turtle Island, that I walk on. In addition to the classic don't whistle or say its name at night, I've made it very clear to my close friends who have all heard this story, and respectfully know me as the outdoorsy camping friend, that if I ever feel anything similar to being watched or that we shouldn't be in these woods, to get the duck out with me. So this is my story of what I believe was my encounter with a skinwalker. I have no evidence, but I promise you that this story is real. I've always been a bit of a skeptic, ever since I was a kid. Scary stories don't faze me, horror games never frighten me, and whenever I hear something weird at night, I instantly assume it's something normal, an animal or just the house settling. Despite this, something very unsettling happened to me the other day, and I'm really not sure what to make of it. I think it's the first time in years I've been genuinely frightened. I live in a forested area in the US. Me and my girlfriend live in a large cabin, and although there are roads nearby, our nearest neighbors are at least a kilometer away. We also have 2 cats, one of which sleeps in the bedroom with us, while the other often goes out at night and does whatever cats do when they're out of sight. Anyway, I like to stay up late at night and sleep late into the morning, whereas my girlfriend's an early bird. It was about 1 in the morning, and I was watching crappy TV in the living room while my girlfriend slept in the bedroom. I was beginning to grow tired when I heard something outside, near the cat flap. For clarity, our cat flap uses an electronic chip, so only our cats can use it. I assumed it was just one of the cats coming into or leaving the house, and I ignored it. Then I heard it again. It sounded like something thudding against the flat. It happened several times at random intervals, until I lost my patience and decided to just go and open the door. Clearly, the cat was having trouble getting in. I never thought about it at the time, but this was weird because we feed our cats well, and they're very lean rather than chubby. I passed the bedroom and peered in as I walked past to see if my girlfriend heard the noises. She was fast asleep, but the cat that sleeps with us was staring out the window. I called her by name. Nothing. She kept staring. I shrugged it off and kept heading towards the kitchen. The back doors are through there, by the way. Anyway, so I reached the back door and saw a dark shape through the translucent flap. I sighed, expecting the cat to be out there, and opened the door. It took me a moment to open the door, and I saw the cat tense up as I opened the door. The door opened fully. I froze. It wasn't my cat. Whatever it was had started moving before I opened up, and I only caught a glimpse of a distorted figure, kind of like a tailless dog, bolting, and I mean absolutely pelting it. I freaked out and slammed the door shut. What the hell was it? I wasn't sure. My natural skepticism kicked in, and I assumed it was just my other cat, and I had merely startled it. Perhaps the darkness had made it appear larger. Nevertheless, I was creeped out and decided to go to sleep. As I slipped into bed, I realized something horrifying. The second cat was asleep on the rug. It took a while to get to sleep that night. Everything seemed normal until a few hours later. I awoke to a strange feeling of dread. Something wasn't right. My girlfriend was fast asleep. I held my breath and heard something creaking by the door. It sounded too loud to be one of the cats. It was as if a person were walking about. I reached towards my bedside cabinet and flicked on the lamp. The room was illuminated, and I saw something standing just outside the open door. Staring at me. The same twisted figure I had spotted outside earlier. It wasn't very tall, maybe a little over 5 feet, but it was its face that scared me the most. I only caught a glimpse of it, but what I saw will stay with me forever. It looked like a dog, but with an elongated face and almost human-like eyes. You know that weird, distorted snarl hounds pull when they're pissed off? It had that expression. I instantly started yelling profanities as I scrabbled backwards, trying to straighten up. The creature turned and sprinted down the hall. I heard it dash outside and go past the window behind us, just above the headboard. I managed to look out as my girlfriend started to panic as she woke up fully. We both caught a glimpse of whatever the hell this thing was as it dashed off into the woods near our home. Grabbing my trusty shotgun from beneath the bed, as well as a couple rounds from the ammunition box that sits next to it, I ran out of the room in my underwear and rounded into the kitchen. The door was open. I'd forgotten to lock it when I saw the thing originally. I haven't seen it since, and we still live in our cabin, but I've bought sturdy locks for all of the main doors and windows in the house, and I always check the exit points at night. I also go to bed a bit earlier than I used to, so I'm asleep when the freaks of the night start to wake up. I've read a bunch of forums, and the only thing I can compare it to, based on what I saw, is a skinwalker. If you know anything about these things, please let me know. Okay, please help if you have an explanation. I had a very scary experience with something that might have been a weird creature or cryptid thing. This happened very recently. I believe it happened about 3 days ago, on the 1st of August. So I was at my girlfriend's house for the weekend, and I'm at her house pretty much every weekend, Friday to Sunday, so that in and of itself wasn't out of the ordinary. We both recently started college, so she still currently lives with both her mom and dad and 2 younger brothers. It was between 3:40 a.m. and 4:15 a.m.-ish, when the actual creepy stuff began. Everyone else in the house was asleep except for my girlfriend and me, since we always tend to stay up late playing video games or watching movies. We had just finished watching a movie, and we were getting ready to go to sleep. I was getting changed into shorts and a t-shirt to sleep in, and my girlfriend went to the kitchen to get us both a glass of water since her room can get extremely hot and stuffy during the summer. So after getting changed, I was just chilling on the bean bag in her room, waiting for her to get back. At this point, I should explain the basic layout of where she lives, or this next part could get confusing. So her house is about 8 minutes out of city limits, and she has a long driveway that goes from the road up a hill that leads to her house. Her house is surrounded by trees and a fairly dense forest, and her nearest neighbors are a good couple minutes away. At the end of her driveway is a motion sensor that, when activated by movement, then makes 3 loud beeps inside the house. Her dad is a fairly high-ranking military man, so he definitely takes precautions and safety measures to ensure his family's safety. So, like I said before, she was in the kitchen alone between 3 and 4 a.m., and I was still in her bedroom. Her kitchen is down the hallway and through the living room from where her bedroom is, so she should have been back within just a minute or two. She was taking at least triple the usual amount of time, and right before I was going to head to the kitchen to check on her, she walked around the hallway corner with a worried look on her face. She can be spooked pretty easily, so I wasn't that alarmed at first. She handed me the water and then started quickly explaining why she had taken so long. She pretty much said that while she was at the kitchen sink filling up water, She heard a whining sound from outside the 2 windows next to the sink. She figured it was one of her 2 dogs and decided to go to the garage to check on them. They were both curled up in their kennel when she opened the door, asleep, and had only just been woken up by her turning the light on to check on them. She told me at that point that she was pretty confused and slightly uneasy. She walked back into the kitchen and heard this really deep, weird bark coming again from somewhere outside the kitchen windows. And please note that it was 3 or 4 a.m., so it's nearly pitch black outside, especially since the dense trees around their house block out a lot of moonlight. She told me she couldn't see anything, and she hurried back to the room to tell me. I was slightly skeptical at first, since I assumed it was in fact just the dogs and that my girlfriend was just really tired and tripping out. So I agreed to follow her back to the kitchen. At first, I heard nothing for a good 2 minutes. So I decided to try to recreate what she had done. I walk in, turn on the sink, and wait. After another 2 minutes go by, I hear the same freaky whining sound coming from outside the windows. It sounded so much like a wounded animal. I had her turn the lights on in the garage again, which slightly lit up the area outside the windows. But again, there was no sign of any animals or anything. She turns off the light, and we hear the whining sound getting farther away, almost as if the creature had fled up the hill near the kitchen and towards the forest. That was when we realized that it was scared or sensitive to the lights. So we left the kitchen and went back to her room. At this point, I was pretty spooked, and I wanted to make sure that whatever it was, I had been scared off for good. So we go back into the kitchen after a few minutes, both armed with decent-sized knives that my girlfriend has in her room for protection. 5 minutes go by in the kitchen, and it's just silent. But then the whining starts up again. And then a weird, sad barking sound, like something imitating an injured animal, was maybe 10 feet outside the kitchen windows. And in that moment, I realized something. There's no reason some creature would try to imitate injured animal sounds unless it wanted to lure us out and cause us harm. So I get slightly pissed off at it, and I start yelling at it to go away. It goes silent, and I hear very slight movement outside the windows, and then a weird sound, almost as if something was moving alongside the wall right under the window. Then whatever it was lets out this really disturbing and unnatural sound, almost like a loud groaning or growl bid. And let me tell you, my girlfriend and I looked at each other and just sprinted out of the kitchen without a single word. We hid in her room until we passed out at some point around 5 or 6 a.m. We had talked it over, listened to a ton of animal noises, and not a single one got anywhere close to that final unnatural sound. I wouldn't even be able to accurately mimic the sound. It was so eerie and haunting, and I can still hear it in my head. So we did some research the next day, and there are a few known possibilities that we came up with. Werewolf, skinwalker, or some type of shapeshifter perhaps? We looked around outside in the morning, and there was no blood and no tracks, so definitely not an injured animal. However, on the hill, about 10 feet in front of the kitchen windows, we saw 2 heavy indents in the ground and then flattened grass leading up. We decided to tell one of my girlfriend's brothers about our experience so that he could help test something. We had one person go inside the kitchen sink near the windows, and the others walk around in various different places near the windows, making sounds, to try and triangulate where the creature had been standing. We concluded it was at one point no more than 5 feet from the windows, and then at another point had fled up the hill, which matched with the trampled grass and indents leading up the hill. Further up the hill, there is a path that branches, and one part of the path is fairly abandoned and overgrown. Nobody had walked there in at least 2 years. And I followed it to the end and kept going a little farther, looking for tracks. I did manage to find something interesting: 3-foot-tall ferns and brambles almost completely flattened, and a few twigs snapped perfectly in half, as if something decently large had walked through that area in a hurry, and it seemed very recent. We then decided to tell my girlfriend's parents about it, and her dad seemed especially interested in it. He told us that the wood panels on their pump house had been torn off within the last couple days. He then took one of their dogs into the woods, and we asked him to check for any signs. He came back, and about 2 days later he installed a camera right next to the kitchen windows, where we heard those sounds. And again, he is a pretty high-ranking military man, and he 100% believed that something was there that night. So if anyone has any input, thoughts, or explanations, that would be really helpful. Did I encounter a skinwalker? So a few years ago, I was out with friends. We decided to go back to their place, which is a 30-minute drive through nothing but country, trees, and houses scattered here and there. I was driving alone, as we had originally met up. It was a cool summer night, so I was riding with my driver's side window down, probably because I had been smoking and left it down. I came to a stop sign at a crossroads in the middle of nowhere in the woods. I was taking a left and hadn't fully stopped when a canine-like thing, not a dog, not a coyote, came barreling full speed from within the woods at me. I stomped the gas, It was making a sound only heard in movies or a dog or wolf attack, and it never stopped running in pursuit of me even as I took off. It almost made it to my open window, and here's the thing, I could feel the hatred and intent rolling off it. I knew it had been waiting in the woods, I knew that it knew my window was down and its intention. It almost felt like a telepathic thought process was taking place. At the time I was so shaken, I screamed in fear, then cried and tried to convey what had happened to my friends at their house when I arrived, but to no avail. There is no capturing what happened or truly being able to explain it. The thought of a skinwalker had never crossed my mind, as I was pretty unfamiliar with the term, but I knew I had experienced something akin to the paranormal. Since then, I've heard a few stories about them, and some things in the stories have changed. Any thoughts?